My name is Nia, and at 32 years old, I quietly signed the divorce, letting my husband believe he had won everything. He thought he had left me with nothing but a broken heart and an empty bank account. But he forgot one crucial detail. He forgot to ask who my father really was. Within days, his so-called self-made empire began to crumble deal by deal and secret by secret until the man who betrayed me had nothing left but regret. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth and tried to discard you. The evening began like any other high society event in Buckhead. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was transformed into a winter wonderland for Julian's annual charity gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the wealthy elite of Atlanta. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. I stood near a massive, intricate ice sculpture carved into the shape of a soaring eagle, which was the logo of Julian's real estate firm. I was dressed in a simple, elegant black gown, playing the role I had perfected over the last 7 years. The supportive, humble wife of the self-made king. Julian was working the room with the effortless charm that had first drawn me to him. His custom-tailored suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and his smile flashed bright for every photographer who asked for a picture. He looked every bit the successful mogul he claimed to be, but the warmth in his eyes never reached me anymore. We had built this life together from the ground up, but lately I felt more like a prop than a partner. As the jazz band began to play a lively tune, Julian finally excused himself from a group of investors and made his way toward me. I smiled, preparing to ask him how the donation pledges were going, but the coldness in his expression stopped me. He stepped close, invading my personal space and shielding us from the view of the main floor using the large ice sculpture. He kept a perfect camera-ready smile on his face, but his voice was like ice. He slipped a thick manila folder from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pressed it firmly against my chest. I instinctively reached up and grabbed it, my fingers brushing against the rough paper. I looked down at the folder and then back up at him, completely confused. "Open it," he whispered through a gritted smile, so no one around us would notice anything amiss. I flipped open the cover. The bold black letters at the top of the first page swam before my eyes. Petition for dissolution of marriage. It was a divorce decree. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked at the man I had loved for 7 years, the man I had stood by when he had absolutely nothing, and I searched his face for any sign of a joke. There was none. Only a cruel, calculating smugness. "Sign it," Julian said, his voice barely audible over the chatter of the party. "Do not make a scene, Naya. The cameras are everywhere, and I will not have you embarrass me tonight." "Embarrass you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Julian, what is this? We were just talking about starting a family last week." He let out a low, mocking chuckle. He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne suddenly suffocating me. "We are not starting a family, Nia. I am starting a family. Look across the room, over by the VIP tables." I turned my head slightly, following his gaze. Standing near the VIP section holding a glass of sparkling cider was Sasha. She was the 25-year-old public relations director for Julian's firm. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress that clung to her figure. But it was not the dress that caught my attention. It was the necklace resting against her collarbone. A custom-designed emerald-cut diamond pendant. The exact necklace Julian had given me for our 5th wedding anniversary. I had been looking for it for weeks, and he had convinced me I must have misplaced it. "Sasha is pregnant with my son Julian," said, his words hitting me like physical blows. "She gives me what I actually need. A woman who matches my status. A woman who looks good on the arm of a billionaire. You have always been too small-minded, Nia. Too content with mediocrity. You do not fit in my world anymore." I stared at him, letting his words wash over me. He thought I was mediocre. He thought I did not understand wealth. If only he knew the truth. Before I could process the sheer audacity of his betrayal, A familiar, harsh voice cut through the tension. Well, I hope you are not going to start crying and ruin that cheap makeup, Nia. I turned to see Kendra, Julian's younger sister, strolling up to us. She was sipping a glass of champagne, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. Kendra had always hated me. She was a woman who worshipped labels and status, and she constantly belittled my simple tastes. She ran a luxury spa in the city and carried herself like royalty, completely forgetting that she grew up in the exact same modest neighborhood as Julian. Kendra smirked and tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the manila folder in my hands. You might as well sign it and get it over with, she said loudly enough for a passing waiter to glance our way. Julian has already moved all his significant assets into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. He planned this months ago. You are not getting a dime of his real money. Be a good girl. Take whatever little settlement he is offering and go back to your little art gallery. You never belonged with us anyway. Julian nodded in agreement, his eyes cold and distant. She is right, Nia. My lawyers are the best in the state. If you try to fight this, I will drag this out in court until you are drowning in legal fees. I will take the apartment. I will take the cars. And I will leave you with absolutely nothing. Just sign the papers and walk away quietly. They stood there, a united front of arrogance and greed, waiting for me to break down. They expected me to scream or cry or beg. They expected the helpless woman they thought I was to fall to her knees. But I did not cry. A strange, absolute calm washed over me. For 7 years I had hidden my true identity from Julian. I never wanted a man to love me for my money. I wanted a pure marriage built on trust and mutual struggle. When we met, I was working as a junior art curator, and he was an ambitious real estate agent with big dreams and empty pockets. I let him believe we were equals. I cheered him on when he closed his first big deal, never telling him that the silent investor who funded that project was my father. I played the role of the ordinary wife so perfectly that I had almost convinced myself. But looking at Julian, now standing beside his vicious sister and flaunting his pregnant mistress across the room, the illusion shattered completely. He was not a self-made king. He was a fraud who had built his castle on my family's hidden land, and now he was trying to evict me from it. I slowly closed the folder. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. It was a graduation gift from my father. I clicked the cap off with a sharp snap that made Julian flinch slightly. I did not bother reading the terms. I did not care what table scraps he was offering me or what Cayman Island accounts he thought he had hidden from the world. I knew something he did not. I placed the folder against the smooth, cold surface of the ice sculpture. I pressed the pen to the signature line on the final page and signed my name with smooth, elegant strokes. Nia Pierce, not Nia Reynolds. I had never legally changed my last name, but he was always too busy looking at his own reflection to notice the fine print on our tax returns. I capped the pen and handed the folder back to him. Julian took it, looking slightly confused by how easily I had surrendered. He opened his mouth to say something, probably another cruel remark, to assert his dominance, but I cut him off. Congratulations, Julian, I whispered, my voice perfectly steady and clear. You got exactly what you wanted, but I hope your empire is as solid as your loyalty. Because everything built on lies eventually falls apart. I turned my back on him and Kendra without another word. I did not look at Sasha as I walked across the grand ballroom. I kept my head held high, my posture perfect. I could feel Julian's eyes on my back, likely smirking to himself, thinking he had won the ultimate victory. He thought he had successfully discarded a heavy burden. I stepped out of the suffocating heat of the ballroom and into the cool, crisp night air of Atlanta. The valet saw me approaching and immediately rushed to get my coat. The noises of the party faded behind the heavy glass doors of the hotel. I stood alone under the glow of the streetlights. I reached into the hidden zippered pocket of my clutch and pulled out an old bulky burner phone. It was the one piece of my past I had kept hidden all these years. I powered it on, watching the small screen flicker to life. I dialed a private encrypted number I had not called since the day I married Julian. The line rang exactly twice before a deep, commanding voice answered. "Nia," the voice said, sounding unsurprised. "Dad," I replied, staring out at the city skyline. "You were right. The charity case is over. I am done playing the poor supportive wife. Unfreeze the trust fund. It is time to teach this self-made king who actually built his throne." A low, dark chuckle echoed through the receiver. "I will send the car, Nia. And we are not just taking his crown. We are taking the entire kingdom." I ended the call with my father and slipped the burner phone back into my clutch. The sleek black Maybach would take exactly 30 minutes to navigate through the heavy Buckhead traffic. In the meantime, I decided to head to the penthouse Julian and I shared. It was only 2 blocks away from the hotel where the charity gala was still raging. I walked the short distance, letting the cool night air clear my mind. I needed to grab my passport and a few deeply personal items my mother had left me before she passed away. Those were things I could not bear to leave in Julian's greedy hands. I arrived at the luxury high-rise where our penthouse occupied the entire top floor. I had designed every single square inch of that living space. I had spent months sourcing the reclaimed wood flooring and commissioning the modern art pieces that hung in the foyer. Julian had simply written the checks using the massive profits from the real estate deals my family had secretly guaranteed. The night concierge Marcus gave me a highly sympathetic look, but quickly averted his eyes when I approached the private elevator. That was my first warning. I swiped my keycard against the brass reader. A sharp red light blinked, followed by a harsh buzzing sound. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the card firmly against the sensor. The exact same red light flashed, mocking me. Before I could ask Marcus what was going on, the heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid open. Out stepped Vance, Julian's head of security. Vance was a towering, intimidating man who had always treated me with veiled disrespect, taking his cues directly from Julian and Kendra. He was carrying a single black trash bag. He walked over and dropped the bag right at my feet. The sound of cheap plastic hitting the pristine marble floor echoed loudly in the quiet, empty luxury lobby. "Mr. Reynolds left strict orders," Vance said, his thick arms crossed over his massive chest. "You are permanently locked out of the residence and the building. He had the cleaning staff pack a few of your everyday items. Everything else remains his property, as per the prenuptial agreement you just signed away in that divorce decree." I stared down at the black trash bag. Inside were probably my oldest gym clothes and some basic travel toiletries. I did not care about the designer handbags or the expensive shoes Julian had bought me for public appearances. I only cared about the framed photograph of my mother and the small wooden jewelry box she had given me before she died. "Where are my personal documents?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and steady. "My mother's jewelry box." Vance smirked, a nasty little smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Reynolds said any disputed items will be handled by his legal team during the settlement phase. Now I suggest you take your trash and leave the premises before I have to forcefully escort you out of the lobby." I looked at Vance, then down at the trash bag again. I did not bend down to pick it up. I simply stepped right over it, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. "Keep it," I told him, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "He will need something basic to wear when the federal authorities come to take his tailored suits." Vance frowned, his thick brows pulling together, clearly confused by my calm response. I did not wait for him to process the insult. I turned and walked straight out of the lobby, the heavy glass doors sliding shut behind me with a soft thud. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the aggressive vibration of my regular cell phone inside my clutch. I pulled it out and unlocked the screen. My display was completely flooded with automated notifications from our joint banking application. Alert: primary account frozen. Alert: joint credit card suspended. Alert: transfer limit reached. Julian was incredibly thorough. I had to give him credit for that. He was actively trying to financially strand me in the middle of the night on the streets of Atlanta. He wanted me to feel utterly helpless and abandoned. He wanted me to panic, call him crying, and beg for a place to stay. I opened my ride-sharing application to call a car just to test the limits of his petty revenge. I selected my premium credit card for the payment method. The screen flashed red. Declined. I selected my secondary emergency card. Declined again. A new notification popped up at the very top of my screen. It was a direct text message from Sasha. I clicked on the preview to open it. It was a brightly lit selfie of her lying in my custom-made Italian leather bed, wearing my favorite silk pajamas. The diamond anniversary necklace Julian had given me was resting prominently against her collarbone, catching the bedroom light. The caption underneath the photo read, "Time to go back to the projects, sweetie." I zoomed in on the photo. Sasha had a smug, victorious smile on her face. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the expensive bed she was lying on was legally registered to my private holding company. She thought she was permanently replacing me, but she was just temporarily renting my space. I stared at the photograph and a genuine loud laugh escaped my lips. They really thought they had won this war. They thought this was the pathetic end of my story. They had absolutely no idea the terrifying level of power they were blindly playing with. A pair of blinding LED headlights suddenly cut through the darkness of the street. A pristine custom black Maybach pulled up to the curb, stopping right in front of me. The tinted rear window rolled down silently, revealing the sharp, observant features of Marcus, my father's personal driver and head of corporate security. Unlike Vance, who was just a glorified club bouncer, Marcus was a highly trained former intelligence officer who commanded genuine fear and respect in the global corporate world. "Good evening, Ms. Pierce," Marcus said, his voice deep, rich, and completely respectful. "Your father is waiting for you." He stepped out of the heavy armored vehicle and opened the rear passenger door for me. I slid into the luxurious, soft leather interior, leaving Julian's building, his ridiculous security guard, and my old fake life behind on the sidewalk. As the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, I tossed my old phone, the one displaying Sasha's ridiculous mocking selfie, directly into the small built-in trash compartment of the car. I would not be needing that number or those people anymore. The drive to my father's private estate took 45 minutes, leaving the crowded city lights behind and entering the sprawling, heavily gated communities of the true elite. The Pierce family had owned this land for 3 generations. We pulled up to the massive iron gates of Pierce Manor. The gates swung open automatically, recognizing the encrypted military-grade signal from the vehicle. We drove up the long, winding driveway flanked by ancient towering oak trees. The estate was a massive stone mansion that looked more like an impenetrable fortress than a home. It was the perfect physical representation of my father. My father was waiting for me in his massive private study. Desmond Pierce was a man who rarely appeared in public magazines, but whose mere name could make arrogant Wall Street executives sweat through their expensive suits. He was sitting behind his massive polished mahogany desk, pouring 2 large glasses of aged rare bourbon. He looked up as I entered the room, his sharp, calculating eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness. "You did not cry," he noted, stepping around the desk and handing me a heavy crystal glass. I took a slow sip, letting the smooth, intense burn ground me in reality. "There is absolutely nothing to cry over," I said firmly. "I spent 7 years building a man who turned out to be nothing more than a hollow, pathetic shell. I am not grieving the loss of Julian Reynolds. I am just annoyed I wasted my valuable time trying to make him a king." My father chuckled deeply and leaned back against his large desk. "I warned you about him, Nia. I told you years ago that men like Julian do not understand loyalty or sacrifice. They only understand leverage and dominance. You wanted to build him up from nothing. You wanted to be the perfect, supportive, quiet wife. And what did he do with all your effort? He took your incredible grace for weakness." He reached across the desk and handed me a thick, leather-bound digital tablet. I opened the cover. It was a highly detailed, real-time financial portfolio of Julian's entire real estate company. It listed every single asset, every massive liability, and every supposedly hidden offshore account. He thinks he cleverly hid his money from me, I told my father quickly, scanning the staggering numbers on the bright screen. He transferred everything he had into a shell company in the Cayman Islands to protect it from the divorce settlement. My father smiled a cold, predatory grin that I suddenly realized I had inherited from him. Yes, he did. Apex Holdings. A very clever textbook move for a financial novice. Unfortunately for Julian, I aggressively bought the private bank that houses Apex Holdings last Tuesday morning. His money is currently sitting completely locked inside my personal vault. I looked up at my father, the absolute reality of his unlimited power washing over me. He really is broke, I whispered, feeling a sudden intense thrill of anticipation. He is much worse than broke, my father corrected, taking another slow sip of bourbon. He is massively over-leveraged. Julian has been borrowing heavily against his own fake success to fund this massive new mega project of his called the Horizon. He needs exactly $150 million in mezzanine financing by the end of this week, or he defaults on all his current outstanding loans. His entire real estate empire is a fragile house of cards, Nia, and we are the ones holding the fan. I walked slowly over to the large floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the perfectly manicured dark grounds of the estate. Julian had deliberately humiliated me in front of hundreds of influential people. He had proudly flaunted his pregnant young mistress and tried to leave me on the street with a literal trash bag of cheap clothes. He thought he could discard me easily because he assumed I had no inherent value without him. I do not just want to ruin him financially, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, steady register. I want him to understand exactly who he carelessly crossed. I want him to lose everything he desperately values: his fake status, his fake reputation, and his actual freedom. My father walked over and joined me by the window, looking out into the night. To catch a greedy rat, you have to let him think he has safely found the cheese. Julian is completely desperate for that financing. He will frantically seek out private equity firms tomorrow morning. When he finally does, we will be waiting for him with open arms. I turned to face my father, my decision firmly made. I want to handle this, Dad. I want to be the one who systematically dismantles his entire life piece by piece, deal by deal. Then it is time you officially took your rightful place, my father said, placing a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. No more hiding behind a false, humble name. No more playing small just to make an insecure, arrogant man feel big. Tomorrow morning, you step into the headquarters of Pierce Holdings as the new chief executive officer. You will oversee the complete dismantling of Julian's company personally. I finished the rest of my bourbon and set the heavy crystal glass down heavily on his mahogany desk. Julian's arrogant sister Kendra genuinely thinks she is safe too. She was right there with him tonight, laughing at my dress and calling me trash. She proudly runs that massive luxury spa in Buckhead. My father walked back to his desk and tapped a few quick buttons on his digital tablet, pulling up another detailed legal file. The premium commercial spa located at the corner of Peachtree and Lenox. Yes, I see it. Pierce Commercial Real Estate silently acquired that entire luxury building last month. The current legal landlord of that property is you. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Kendra was always aggressively bragging about her prestigious retail location. She used it constantly to belittle my friends and act completely superior to everyone around her. It was finally time to show her what real generational wealth and power actually looked like. Cancel her lease, I said without a single ounce of hesitation. Have the legal eviction notices drawn up immediately tonight. I want her and her cheap equipment completely out of my building in 48 hours. And make sure the eviction notice is delivered during her busiest operating hours. I want her wealthy clients to watch her get thrown out onto the street. Consider it done, my father said, his eyes shining with absolute pride. And Nia. I paused at the heavy oak door of the study and looked back at him, waiting. Welcome home. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom at the estate. The sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine antique furniture. For the first time in 7 years, I did not wake up feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of Julian's expectations pressing down on my chest. I felt light. I felt incredibly dangerous. I walked into my massive walk-in closet, which my father's staff had completely restocked over the last 24 hours. My old wardrobe, consisting of modest department store dresses to make Julian feel better about his own spending, was entirely gone. In its place hung rows of absolute haute couture. I bypassed the sleek modern gowns and selected something specifically meant to send a message. It was a vintage, unreleased pink tweed Chanel suit. It was a piece from a private archival collection that money simply could not buy unless you had the right last name. I paired it with a simple, elegant pearl choker and slipped on a pair of classic pumps. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The humble, quiet wife was dead. The billionaire heiress was fully awake. Today was the annual spring brunch for the elite alumnae of my historically Black university. It was a highly exclusive gathering held at a private country club in the heart of the city. These women were judges, surgeons, politicians, and top-tier executives. For years, I had attended these brunches, keeping a low profile and letting Kendra dominate the conversation with her flashy designer bags and loud bragging. Julian's sister had never actually attended an HBCU. She had barely finished community college, but she always managed to snag a guest invitation through one of her wealthy spa clients just so she could network and pretend she belonged in our world. Marcus drove me to the country club in the Maybach. As we pulled up to the grand entrance, I instructed him to wait right by the front doors. I wanted to make a quick, highly effective exit. I walked through the double doors of the banquet hall, and the low hum of elegant chatter immediately washed over me. The room was decorated with lush floral arrangements, and sunlight poured over the beautifully set tables. It did not take me long to spot Kendra. She had strategically positioned herself at a central table completely surrounded by some of the most influential women in Atlanta. And sitting right next to her, looking incredibly out of place, but trying desperately to look wealthy, was Sasha. Julian's pregnant 25-year-old mistress was wearing another one of my old dresses. It was a pathetic attempt to physically replace me in my own social circle. As I calmly walked closer to their table, I could hear Kendra's loud, piercing voice carrying over the polite conversations of the other guests. She was practically shouting, ensuring everyone in the immediate vicinity could hear her. "Honestly, I just feel so bad for her," Kendra said, taking a large sip of her mimosa. Julian finally had to cut the cord. Nia was just dragging him down. "She has absolutely no business sense and zero class. He gave her everything, and she still looked like she shopped at a discount rack. Look at Sasha here. Now this is a woman who knows how to represent a successful man." A few of the women at the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the blatant disrespect, but Kendra was entirely too wrapped up in her own ego to notice. And besides, Kendra continued waving her hand dismissively. "I just secured a massive 10-year lease for my luxury spa in the most expensive commercial district in Buckhead. The rent alone is more than Nia will ever see in her lifetime. I told the leasing agent to make sure the security guards keep her out of the lobby. She could never afford a facial there now anyway. She is probably looking for a roommate in the suburbs right now." Sasha let out a high-pitched, annoying giggle and placed a protective hand over her completely flat stomach. I stopped right behind Kendra's chair. The women sitting across the table saw me first. Their eyes went wide and their conversations stopped instantly. They took in my vintage Chanel suit, the flawless blowout, and the absolute icy calm radiating from my face. They knew immediately that something monumental had shifted. "It is fascinating how loudly you project your own insecurities, Kendra," I said. My voice was low, smooth, and carried perfectly across the sudden silence of the table. Kendra froze. She slowly turned around, her mouth dropping open slightly as she took in my appearance. She tried to quickly mask her shock with her usual sneer, but her eyes betrayed her panic. She looked at my suit, then at the massive, flawless diamond signet ring shining on my right hand. "Naya," she stammered, recovering her nasty tone. What are you doing here? You do not belong here anymore. Julian canceled your membership to this club this morning. I smiled gently, leaning down slightly so I was at eye level with her. Julian does not have the authority to cancel a legacy membership that my family endowed 30 years ago. But I am not here to enjoy the brunch. I am simply here to deliver a message. I reached into my classic quilted handbag and pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing the heavy gold-embossed seal of Pierce Commercial Real Estate. I held it between two fingers, dangling it perfectly over her crystal mimosa glass. You were just loudly bragging about your new 10-year lease in Buckhead, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. The building on the corner of Peachtree and Lenox. A beautiful location, really. It is a shame you did not read the fine print regarding the transfer of ownership clauses. Kendra frowned, her heavy makeup creasing. What are you talking about? My lease is ironclad. I dealt directly with the management company yesterday. You dealt with a management company that was legally acquired at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I corrected her. And the new owner of that entire commercial high-rise has decided to completely restructure the tenant portfolio. I let go of the envelope. It dropped straight down, landing directly inside her glass. The thick paper instantly soaked up the orange juice and champagne, ruining her drink. The building changed ownership, Kendra. I am the new landlord, and I absolutely do not rent to trash. Your lease is officially terminated. You have exactly 48 hours to pack up your cheap massage tables and vacate my property before my security team throws it all into a dumpster on the street. The entire table gasped. Several women at the adjacent tables who had been openly eavesdropping covered their mouths in pure shock. Kendra stared down at the ruined envelope in her glass, her face turning an ugly shade of dark red. "You are lying!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden hysteria. "You do not have that kind of money! Julian took everything from you. You are a broke, pathetic nobody." She lunged forward, completely losing her composure. But before she could even get out of her chair, a massive hand clamped firmly down on her shoulder. Marcus had quietly stepped up behind me, his towering presence immediately terrifying everyone at the table. He pressed Kendra back into her seat with effortless strength. Sasha tried to stand up, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You cannot do this to her!" she yelled, trying to play the tough girl. "Julian will ruin you for this." I finally looked directly at Sasha. My gaze was completely dead. Julian is going to be far too busy trying to keep himself out of federal prison to worry about a failing strip mall spa, I told her calmly. "Enjoy the necklace, Sasha. I hear the pawn shops give a decent rate for used jewelry." I turned away from the table, leaving them both in a state of absolute humiliating shock. Kendra suddenly screamed violently, swiping her ruined mimosa glass off the table. It shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, causing the entire banquet hall to fall dead silent. She began cursing and yelling, struggling against the polite but firm restraint of the country club staff, who were now rushing over to handle the disturbance. I did not look back. I walked smoothly out of the banquet hall, the satisfying sound of Kendra's public meltdown echoing behind me. I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the bright spring sunshine. Marcus was immediately at my side, opening the door to the Maybach. I slid into the luxurious back seat, feeling a deep, resonant sense of satisfaction. I had taken her single greatest source of pride and crushed it in front of the very people she desperately wanted to impress. It was a surgical strike. Precise, clean, and utterly devastating. As Marcus closed my door and got into the driver's seat, my new encrypted phone began to vibrate violently in my handbag. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. The news of Kendra's public humiliation and the sudden eviction notice had undoubtedly reached him with lightning speed. I swiped the screen and accepted the call, bringing the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply listened to the heavy, angry breathing on the other end of the line. "You think a petty eviction scares me?" Julian snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute raw fury. "You think kicking my sister out of her building makes you powerful? You are playing a stupid, dangerous game, Nia." I crossed my legs and leaned back against the soft leather seat. I am not playing a game, Julian, I replied, my tone completely indifferent. I am simply cleaning house. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh, but I could hear the faint edge of panic hiding underneath his bravado. You think you won something today, he spat. You think you can embarrass my family and walk away. You have absolutely no idea what I am capable of. Wait until you see what I do to your little art gallery tomorrow. I will make sure you never sell a single painting in this city again. I will crush your pathetic little business until you are begging me for spare change. I smiled, staring out the tinted window at the passing luxury homes. That sounds terrifying, Julian, I said softly. I eagerly look forward to seeing your next move. I ended the call with Julian and slipped the encrypted phone back into my quilted handbag. I did not feel fear or anxiety. I felt a cold, calculated anticipation. I told Marcus to take me directly to my art gallery in Midtown Atlanta. The Pierce Gallery of Fine Arts was my absolute sanctuary. I had built the space from the ground up using my own strategic vision. I used my maiden name for the business, though Julian had always arrogantly assumed it was just a cute little vanity project funded by my meager personal savings. He thought I spent my days arranging pretty pictures to keep myself occupied, while he supposedly did the real heavy lifting of building our financial future. As I walked through the sleek, heavy glass doors of the gallery, the atmosphere inside was thick with absolute panic. My gallery director, Elise, was standing behind the pristine white reception desk, holding a digital tablet and looking completely frantic. Her hands were physically shaking as she frantically swiped through a never-ending stream of incoming messages. Nia, I do not know what is going on, she said, her voice trembling. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. 3 of our major sculptors just called and demanded we pull their pieces from the upcoming spring exhibition. They refused to give me a clear reason, and it gets much worse. The RSVPs for tomorrow night are dropping like flies. The mayor's office, the city council members, the entire Buckhead executive board, and our top 5 highest spending private collectors all suddenly canceled their attendance within the last hour. I calmly walked over to the desk and took the tablet from her shaking hands. I scrolled through the massive list of sudden cancellations. Julian was moving incredibly fast. He was aggressively using his heavy influence in the local commercial real estate sector and his deep political connections to effectively blacklist my gallery across the entire city. He was calling in every single favor he had ever traded. He was threatening to pull his own massive corporate sponsorships from city events if anyone dared to associate with me or my business. My premier spring exhibition, which had taken me 8 exhausting months to curate, was rapidly becoming a complete ghost town. Elise was practically in tears, deeply worried about her job and the future of the gallery. She knew how much capital we had tied up in this specific event. I reached out and gently patted her shoulder. Take a deep breath, Elise. I told her, my voice soothing and completely level. Everything is perfectly fine. I want you to go home. Take the rest of the day off, and take tomorrow off, as well with your full pay. Lock the administrative system down, and forward all the gallery phone lines directly to my personal voicemail. But the exhibition, she stammered, looking around at the beautiful, valuable pieces hanging on the walls. We are going to be ruined. We are not going to be ruined, I assured her with a confident smile. Just do exactly as I ask. I need the gallery completely empty for the rest of the afternoon. Elise hesitated, but she knew better than to question me when I used that specific tone of voice. She quickly gathered her things, grabbed her coat, and practically ran out the back door. I walked over to the main control panel and adjusted the gallery lighting, creating a bright, highly focused environment. Then I simply stood in the center of the polished concrete floor and waited. Exactly 1 hour later, the heavy glass front doors swung open with an aggressive push. Julian strolled into the gallery, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, looking like he owned the entire city block. Right beside him, clinging tightly to his arm, was Sasha. She was holding a steaming designer coffee cup and looking around the pristine white walls with a bored, exaggerated expression of unimpressed judgment. "Wow," Julian said loudly, his deep voice echoing obnoxiously in the completely empty, quiet space. "It is awfully quiet in here, Nia, having a slow business day." He walked confidently over to a massive abstract canvas I had personally curated from a brilliant upcoming artist in Paris. He sneered at it, shaking his head as if he were a renowned art critic instead of a man who bought his taste from magazines. "I warned you on the phone, Nia," he said, turning to face me. "You mess with my family, I completely destroy yours. You thought you could humiliate Kendra, and I would just let it slide. I made exactly 6 phone calls this morning. 6. That is all it took to completely dismantle this pathetic little hobby of yours. I told the elite collectors that your gallery was currently under a quiet federal investigation for tax fraud. I told the city officials that I would pull my campaign funding if they ever stepped foot in this building. Your artists are gone. Your wealthy buyers are gone. Your reputation is entirely ash. You are effectively out of business in Atlanta as of right now." Sasha giggled a high-pitched grating sound and took a slow sip of her coffee. "It really is a massive shame," she chimed in, tracing her manicured finger along the edge of a bronze sculpture. "The space itself is actually decent. Maybe Julian can gut it and turn it into a pop-up leasing office for his new development team. At least then, this building would actually generate some real money." Julian puffed out his chest, completely fueled by his own massive ego and Sasha's pathetic flattery. "The horizon," he proclaimed, looking at me as if I were an absolute peasant standing in his royal court. $800 million of prime commercial and residential development. It features twin glass towers, luxury penthouse condos, and the most exclusive retail space in the entire state. It will completely redefine the skyline of this city. It is the absolute biggest deal of my entire life. A massive project you could not even begin to comprehend with your small, simple mind. I am entirely untouchable now, Nia. I sit at high-stakes tables you cannot even serve water at." He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook. He retrieved a gold pen from his pocket and hastily scribbled something onto the paper. He ripped the check out of the binding and carelessly, casually tossed it into the air. The small piece of paper fluttered down slowly, catching the bright gallery lights before landing face up on the cold, polished concrete floor. It landed exactly 2 inches from the toe of my vintage Chanel pump. $10,000, Julian said, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a smug, satisfied grin. "Consider it a highly generous severance package. Take it, pay off whatever small debts you have for this failing gallery. Buy yourself a nice little apartment out in the quiet suburbs and completely disappear. If I ever see your face in my city again, I will personally make sure you cannot even get a minimum wage job sweeping floors." I did not move. I slowly looked down at the check resting on the cold floor. $10,000. As I stared at the pathetic sum of money, my mind instantly flashed back to a sweltering, humid summer day exactly 5 years ago. Julian was frantically pacing back and forth in the cramped living room of our tiny starter apartment. He was sweating heavily, crying real tears, completely panicked and hyperventilating. He had foolishly over-leveraged himself on his very first ambitious real estate flip, and the bank was threatening to foreclose. He was dead broke. He had zero credit, no angel investors, and absolutely no way out. He had fallen to his knees on our cheap linoleum floor, wrapping his arms around my legs, and begged me to help him save his fragile dream. I had quietly walked into the bedroom, packed a small bag, and taken the heavy silver keys to the pristine vintage 1969 Mustang Shelby GT 500 that my grandfather Theodore had left me in his will. It was the only physical piece of my grandfather I had left. I drove the classic car to a wealthy private collector I knew in the art world and sold it for straight cash. I handed Julian that massive stack of money the very next morning. I gave up a priceless, irreplaceable piece of my deeply guarded family history just so he could keep his fragile male pride intact and save his first project. He had wept holding the cash and promised me under oath that he would never ever forget my ultimate sacrifice. Now here he was 5 years later, throwing a tiny fraction of that amount at my feet, like I was a desperate starving beggar on the street. He was completely oblivious to the massive irony that his entire self-made billionaire origin story was literally bought and paid for by the sacrifice of my grandfather's classic car. He truly believed his own fabricated lies. I did not bend down to pick up the check. I did not yell. I did not throw the paper back in his arrogant face. I simply looked up from the floor and met his cold gaze. I let a slow, highly chilling smile naturally spread across my face. It was the exact kind of predatory smile my father used right before he executed a hostile corporate takeover. The horizon. I repeated softly, letting the grand name of his beloved mega-project roll off my tongue like a poisoned candy. It sounds incredibly ambitious, Julian. A true legacy project for a self-made king. I honestly cannot wait to see it break ground. Julian frowned, his broad shoulders stiffening slightly. He was clearly expecting a total meltdown. He wanted tears screaming or desperate pathetic begging. My eerie, absolute calmness deeply unsettled him. He quickly glanced at Sasha, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable standing in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the empty gallery. "You are completely delusional," Julian muttered, shaking his head as if trying to clear away a sudden sense of dread. "Just take the damn money and leave town, Nia. You are entirely out of your league and playing a game you do not understand." He abruptly turned around and briskly walked out the heavy glass front doors, Sasha hurrying closely behind him, struggling to keep up with his angry strides in her tight dress. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, listening to the heavy doors click securely shut behind them. I kept my eyes locked on the $10,000 check lying abandoned on the floor. A moment later, I heard the soft mechanical click of a heavy lock disengaging directly behind me. The concealed reinforced door to my private back office slowly opened outward. My father, Desmond Pierce, stepped out into the bright gallery. He had been sitting quietly in my office the entire time, listening to every single word of Julian's arrogant speech through the slightly cracked door. He walked over with slow, deliberate steps and stood right beside me, looking down at the check on the floor. He let out a low, highly dangerous rumble of a chuckle that vibrated through the quiet room. He took the bait, my father said, his voice deep and dripping with lethal anticipation. His massive ego and his arrogance are completely blinding him to his own fatal financial liabilities. The Horizon project requires exactly $150 million in mezzanine financing by this Friday afternoon, or he triggers a catastrophic default clause on absolutely everything he currently owns. I turned to my father, completely absorbing his absolute confidence. The Horizon project was Julian's massive vanity project, but it was fundamentally built on incredibly shaky ground. Julian had leveraged almost every single asset he legally possessed to secure the initial funding. He desperately needed that final mezzanine loan to finalize the deal and start construction. If he failed to secure that money by Friday, his entire house of cards would rapidly collapse, taking everything down with it. I picked up the pathetic $10,000 check from the polished concrete floor and slowly, deliberately tore it into tiny pieces. Let the pieces fall right there on the floor. "He wants to play a high-stakes public game," I said, a cold, hard edge entering my voice. "Let us give him a stage he cannot possibly resist." I immediately began setting up a highly exclusive pop-up art auction. It was short notice, but my father's massive influence easily secured the permits and a stunning venue overlooking the city. I heavily publicized the event, marketing it as a final desperate liquidation sale for my failing gallery. I deliberately made sure the invitations were prominently circulated among Julian's tightest social and professional circles. I knew his massive, fragile ego would never allow him to miss an opportunity to publicly crush me while flexing his supposed financial dominance. The night of the auction arrived quickly. The venue was packed with curious onlookers wealthy investors and socialites eager for drama. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. I stood at the podium holding a heavy wooden gavel scanning the crowded room. I wore a striking, sharp-tailored emerald green suit that commanded absolute attention. Exactly 10 minutes before the main bidding began, the heavy double doors swung open. Julian sauntered in looking incredibly smug wearing a flashy designer tuxedo. Sasha was practically hanging off his arm dripping in expensive borrowed jewelry. They deliberately took seats right in the very front row, ensuring everyone in the room noticed their grand arrival. Julian leaned back crossing his legs and gave me a highly condescending wave. I ignored his arrogant display and started the auction. We moved quickly through several smaller pieces, building the tension in the room. Then I unveiled the absolute centerpiece of the entire evening. It was a massive, breathtaking contemporary masterpiece that I had secretly acquired from an anonymous, highly prestigious European collector. "We will start the bidding at $50,000. I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. Before anyone else could even raise a paddle, Sasha eagerly threw her hand up in the air. 100,000, she practically yelled, her shrill voice echoing sharply. The crowd murmured in surprise. Julian sat beside her looking incredibly proud, actively encouraging her aggressive bidding. A wealthy collector in the back row hesitantly raised his paddle, offering 120,000. 200,000, Sasha countered immediately, leaning forward with a nasty, aggressive smirk. Julian nodded approvingly, gently patting her hand. The bidding quickly escalated rapidly, becoming a chaotic spectacle. The collector in the back dropped out at 300,000, clearly refusing to play this ridiculous game. Sasha stood up dramatically, pointing directly at the masterpiece. $500,000, she announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard her. A collective massive gasp ripped through the crowded room. $500,000 for a single painting at a pop-up auction was an insane, aggressive flex of raw financial power. Sasha turned around slightly, facing the stunned crowd. "Let us just end this pathetic little charade," she said, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "Julian wants this piece for our new penthouse. We are happy to help out a struggling, failing business owner with her massive debts." Julian beamed, looking around the room, clearly expecting everyone to be entirely mesmerized by his supposed wealth. He was practically vibrating with absolute self-satisfaction. I did not flinch. I did not look embarrassed or humiliated. I looked directly at Sasha and raised the heavy wooden gavel high into the air. "Going," once I said, my voice completely steady. "Going twice." I brought the gavel down with a sharp, cracking bang that echoed loudly off the high ceilings. "Sold to the mistress for $500,000, I announced, my voice crystal clear through the microphone. The room fell completely dead silent. Sasha's arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer furious shock. Julian's face turned a violent shade of red as the crowd erupted into loud, shocked whispers and stifled laughter. I had publicly branded her right in front of the city's entire elite class. If the buyer would please step up to the payment terminal, I continued smoothly, gesturing toward Elise, who was standing nervously by the portable processing machine. "We require immediate payment for all winning bids exceeding $100,000. Sasha aggressively snatched a sleek, heavy black credit card from Julian's waiting hand and angrily marched up to the terminal. She practically shoved the expensive card into Elise's hand, her face twisting with absolute fury. "Run it!" she snapped loudly, trying to quickly regain her aggressive dominance. Elise carefully inserted the heavy black card into the machine. We all waited in complete silence. The machine beeped, processing the massive transaction. Then it let out a sharp, loud, discordant tone. Elise looked down at the screen, her eyes going completely wide. She looked up at Sasha, then over at me. "The card is completely declined," Elise said, her voice trembling slightly, but carrying loudly across the quiet room. Sasha froze entirely. What she demanded, snatching the card back. "That is impossible. Try it again. You obviously ran it wrong, you idiot." Elise flinched but quickly took the card and ran it a second time. The exact same sharp, discordant beep echoed through the tense, silent room. Declined. Elise repeated her voice a little stronger this time. The whispers in the crowd rapidly grew into loud, highly animated chatter. People were actively pointing and staring. Julian quickly stood up, his face now completely pale. He rushed over to the terminal, pulling his wallet out and frantically digging for another card. There must be some ridiculous security hold on the account, Julian muttered aggressively, shoving a different platinum card into the machine. Run this one right now. Elise ran the second card. Declined. She ran a third card. Declined. I slowly stepped away from the podium and walked over to the terminal, leaning casually into the microphone. Well, this is incredibly embarrassing, I announced, ensuring my voice reached every single corner of the large room. It seems the self-made billionaire is experiencing a sudden severe cash flow problem. $500,000 is a massive commitment when your primary accounts have been completely frozen pending an active investigation. Julian whipped his head around, glaring at me with absolute murderous rage. Shut your mouth, Nia, he hissed desperately, trying to keep his voice low. I do not know what you did, but I will absolutely destroy you for this. You cannot even buy a painting, Julian. I replied, my tone completely indifferent. How are you possibly going to fund an $800 million mega project when your black cards are bouncing at a local art auction? I turned back to the microphone, addressing the highly entertained crowd. Shall we accept a post-dated personal check from Mr. Reynolds, or should we go ahead and call the police for deliberate auction fraud? Sasha let out a loud, terrified sob, completely overwhelmed by the intense public humiliation. She threw the heavy black card directly at Julian's chest and turned around quickly, running toward the exit. Julian frantically scrambled to pick up the dropped card, his hands visibly shaking. He looked frantically around the room, making direct eye contact with several highly influential investors who were now actively sneering at him. His carefully crafted illusion of absolute dominance was completely shattered. He had tried to publicly humiliate me and had entirely exposed his own massive financial vulnerability. He turned and practically sprinted toward the door, aggressively shoving past several people to chase after Sasha. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind him, leaving a chaotic, highly amused room behind. I calmly walked back to the podium, tapping the microphone once, to quickly regain their attention. We will now reopen the bidding on the centerpiece, I announced smoothly. Let us start again at $50,000, with buyers who actually have the funds to back up their arrogance. Outside the venue, Julian aggressively dragged Sasha into the waiting luxury limo, roughly slamming the heavy door shut behind them. He was sweating profusely, his breathing shallow and rapid. He violently threw his wallet onto the seat, completely panicked. As the limo sped away into the night, his phone began to ring loudly. It was an urgent call from his chief financial officer. Julian quickly snatched the phone up, his hand shaking wildly. What is it? He barked, his voice cracking under the extreme pressure. Sir, the CFO said, his voice tight with absolute blind panic. The bank just officially pulled out of the Horizon deal entirely. They somehow got wind of a massive freeze on your primary offshore assets. The entire mezzanine loan is completely dead in the water. Julian felt the blood entirely drain from his face. What are you talking about? He yelled. We need that money to close the land purchase by Friday. I know, sir, the CFO replied, sounding completely desperate. But the main lenders have completely backed out. We have exactly 72 hours to find $150 million in completely clean liquid capital, or we legally default on the initial land contracts. If that happens, we lose the entire company. Julian ended the call with his chief financial officer and violently hurled his phone against the reinforced glass partition of the luxury limo. The expensive device shattered instantly, raining sharp fragments onto the plush leather floor. Sasha screamed, covering her face with her trembling hands. But Julian did not even look at her. His chest was heaving, his expensive tuxedo suddenly feeling like a suffocating straitjacket. The terrifying reality of losing his company echoed relentlessly in his mind, entirely drowning out the quiet hum of the vehicle engine. The next morning, Julian's towering glass corner office felt less like a throne room and more like a high-altitude prison cell. He was pacing frantically behind his massive mahogany desk, his custom-tailored suit jacket discarded on a leather chair. His silk tie was yanked loose, and large, dark circles bruised the delicate skin under his eyes. He had not slept a single minute. The terrifying reality of losing the Horizon project and his entire commercial real estate empire had completely stripped away his carefully manicured arrogance. He was actively hemorrhaging money, reputation, and precious time. His chief financial officer, a usually stoic man named Gregory, stood trembling near the door, holding a thick stack of red-lined financial reports. Gregory cleared his throat nervously, trying to get Julian's attention over the chaotic sounds of ringing phones bleeding through the thick walls. "Sir, the primary lenders have officially sent the default warnings," Gregory said, his voice barely above an urgent whisper. "We have exactly 48 hours remaining. If we do not secure the $150 million in liquid capital by Friday afternoon, they will immediately seize the initial land deposits. The firm will instantly go into receivership. We will be completely wiped out." Julian suddenly grabbed a heavy crystal whiskey decanter from his desk and hurled it violently across the room. It shattered against the pristine glass wall, raining expensive liquor and sharp shards over the imported carpet. Gregory flinched, taking a quick step backward. "Do not tell me what I already know!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Find me the money! Call every single private equity firm in the state! Call the massive hedge funds in New York! Call everyone! I am not losing my empire because some spineless bankers got spooked by a minor liquidity issue. We have called everyone," Gregory pleaded, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead. "Nobody is biting. The rumors about your frozen offshore accounts spread through the elite financial sector like wildfire last night. You are currently viewed as entirely radioactive. Nobody wants to touch the Horizon project." Julian collapsed heavily into his leather executive chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. His massive ego was rapidly suffocating him. He had spent years meticulously crafting the perfect image of a flawless self-made billionaire, and now he was drowning in the shallow end of the pool. He could not lose this. He fiercely refused to be publicly humiliated by a woman he considered completely beneath him. Just as the suffocating silence settled over the ruined office, Gregory's encrypted tablet chimed with a high-priority incoming message. He quickly tapped the screen, his eyes scanning the brief text. His expression shifted from pure terror to cautious disbelief. Sir Gregory said, looking up quickly, "We just received a direct inquiry. It is from a highly exclusive private equity firm called Apex Capital. They operate entirely in the shadows, handling massive sums of generational wealth. They say they have been quietly monitoring the Horizon project for several months, and they are incredibly interested in providing the full mezzanine financing." Julian's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. Apex Capital. He had heard hushed whispers of them at elite charity galas. They were known as the absolute apex predators of the financial world, stepping in to fund massive, lucrative deals that traditional conservative banks were too scared to touch. "Get them on the phone," Julian ordered immediately, sitting up straight and hastily adjusting his collar. "Bring them in right now. Do whatever it takes to get them in this building today." Less than 2 hours later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. A tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes stepped into the room. He introduced himself simply as Sterling, the senior broker for Apex Capital. Sterling carried a sleek black leather briefcase and exuded an aura of immense, terrifying wealth. Julian had hastily pulled himself together, putting his suit jacket back on and pasting on his best, confident smile. He gestured for Sterling to sit at the long mahogany table. Kendra, who had rushed to Julian's office early that morning, crying hysterically about her sudden, brutal eviction from her spa location, sat nervously in the corner. She desperately needed Julian to secure this massive funding so he could bail her out of her own devastating financial disaster. Sterling did not waste time with polite small talk. He opened his briefcase and slid a thick, elegantly bound financial contract across the polished table. My firm is prepared to fully fund the $150 million, Mr. Reynolds Sterling said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. The terms are incredibly favorable. We are offering a flat interest rate with a standard 5-year repayment schedule. The funds can be wired directly into your primary operating account by tomorrow morning, ensuring you strictly secure the Horizon land purchase ahead of your final Friday deadline. Julian stared at the heavy contract, feeling a massive wave of absolute euphoric relief wash over him. He eagerly flipped through the crisp pages, his eyes scanning the numbers. It was a complete miracle. It was the absolute perfect lifeline he needed to survive. "This is excellent," Julian said, failing to completely hide the sheer desperation in his voice. "I am ready to sign the agreement right now." "Where is the execution page?" Sterling reached out and gently placed his hand flat over the final pages of the document, stopping Julian. "There is, however, one strict regulatory compliance issue we must address before we can legally execute the wire transfer." Julian frowned, his heart skipping a panicked beat. "What kind of compliance issue?" "My holding company owns the land rights free and clear. This is a federally backed mezzanine loan," Sterling explained, his tone highly professional and unyielding. "Because of the massive scale of the capital involved, federal regulations formally mandate that all primary assets held by the borrower must be heavily scrutinized. According to the public record, you recently filed a petition for the dissolution of your marriage. However, a judge has not yet legally finalized that divorce decree." Julian's jaw tightened in frustration. He had deliberately filed the papers quickly to blindside Nia, but the legal system moved incredibly slowly. So what, he demanded. "I have a bulletproof prenuptial agreement. My estranged wife has absolutely no legal claim to my company or this specific project." Sterling offered a thin, highly polite smile. "That may be absolutely true in a civil divorce court, Mr. Reynolds, but federal lending laws are entirely different. Until a judge officially severs the financial union, your wife effectively retains a secondary legal interest in your overarching estate. Therefore, to fully secure this massive loan against your current corporate assets, federal law dictates your wife must co-sign the final collateral agreement. It is simply a legal formality formally releasing her secondary claim, but it is absolutely mandatory." Julian stared at Sterling in sheer disbelief. "You need Nia to sign this document?" he asked, his voice rising in panic. "That is completely impossible. She is currently trying to actively destroy my reputation. She will never agree to sign anything that financially helps me." Sterling calmly closed his briefcase, clicking the silver latches shut. "That is incredibly unfortunate, Mr. Reynolds. Without her verified legal signature on that specific page, Apex Capital cannot legally release the required funds. If you cannot secure her full cooperation, I am afraid we must formally withdraw our generous offer." Sterling stood up, preparing to leave the silent boardroom. Julian shot out of his chair, sheer panic seizing his chest tightly. "Wait!" he practically shouted, reaching his hand out. "Give me the document. Leave it with me for exactly 1 hour. I will get it properly signed." Sterling paused, looking at Julian with a measured, highly calculating gaze. "Very well. I have several important calls to make. I will wait in your private executive lounge down the hall. You have exactly 1 hour." Sterling walked out smoothly, leaving the heavy contract resting on the mahogany table. As soon as the door clicked shut, Julian began pacing violently, rubbing his aching temples. He was entirely trapped in a desperate corner. There was absolutely no way Nia would ever sign the document. She had just publicly humiliated him at the art auction and viciously evicted his sister. She would rather watch him burn completely to the ground than hand him a simple bucket of water. Kendra quickly stood up from her corner chair and walked purposefully over to the table, looking down at the blank signature line. She looked at her older brother, her eyes narrowing with a dark, incredibly desperate calculation. "Julian," she said, her voice low and remarkably urgent, "you cannot let this entirely fall apart today. If you lose this massive company, I lose absolutely everything too. My spa is entirely gone. I have massive outstanding debts. You promised you would fix this mess. I cannot effortlessly fix this, Julian yelled, gesturing wildly at the thick paper. I desperately need her legal signature, Kendra. I cannot exactly hold a loaded gun to her head and force her to sign. Kendra stepped much closer, aggressively lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. You do not actually need her physically here. You just need her name accurately written on that line. Julian violently stopped pacing and stared directly at his sister, his blood running completely cold. Are you completely insane? He whispered fiercely. That is a strict federal lending document. Forging a legal signature on that specific paper is a massive federal felony. Who is going to possibly know? Kendra pressed aggressively, pushing the heavy document directly toward him. Naya is not going to magically see this private corporate loan file. She does not know anything about Apex Capital. Once the $150 million completely hits your operating account tomorrow morning, you close the Horizon deal immediately. You will be a verified billionaire, Julian. When the messy divorce is finally settled in a few months, you just pay her off quietly with a few $1 million to keep her mouth shut. She will eagerly take the cash and completely disappear. Julian silently stared at the blank signature line. His mind raced frantically, actively weighing the terrifying legal risks. Federal wire fraud. Aggravated forgery. It was absolute sheer madness. But the terrifying alternative was permanently losing his company, his wealth, his elite social status, and everything he had aggressively built. He would be completely bankrupt by Friday afternoon. He would become the absolute laughingstock of Atlanta society. He angrily thought about Nia's smug, arrogant face at the auction, standing at the podium and openly mocking his declined credit cards. He thought about the sheer, unadulterated power he would rightfully wield once the Horizon project was successfully completed. He would be entirely untouchable. You used to do it all the time, Kendra reminded him, softly pushing a sleek silver pen directly into his trembling right hand. You actively practiced her signature for hours, so you could easily sign those joint tax returns when she was out of town. You know exactly how she writes her name. Do it, Julian. Save our family right now. Julian looked down at the expensive silver pen. His massive, fragile ego and his blinding financial desperation finally silenced his last remaining shred of rational fear. He sat heavily in the expensive leather chair and pulled the thick contract incredibly close. He closed his eyes for a brief second, visualizing the elegant, swooping letters of her full name. He had effortlessly forged it dozens of times over the last 7 years, just to bypass minor bureaucratic inconveniences. He pressed the sharp pen tip to the thick paper. His hand moved with smooth, highly practiced precision. He perfectly replicated the exact aggressive slant of her capital N, the sharp, delicate curve of the lowercase a. He quickly finished the signature and lifted the pen, staring intently at the flawless forgery. Nia Pierce. It looked absolutely, completely authentic. He felt a massive, sickening surge of victory directly mingled with an undeniable, overwhelming sense of impending doom. But the dark deed was successfully done. He had aggressively crossed the ultimate legal line. He quickly grabbed his office phone and urgently texted Sterling. It is done. Come back in immediately. A few moments later, Sterling stepped casually back into the silent boardroom. He walked purposefully over to the table and picked up the contract, carefully inspecting the final page. His cold eyes scanned the freshly inked illegal signature. Excellent, Mr. Reynolds, Sterling said, slipping the document securely into his black leather briefcase. Everything appears to be in absolutely perfect order. The funds will be processed for immediate transfer. Julian let out a massive, shaky breath, sinking deeply back into his chair. Thank you, Sterling. You have absolutely no idea what this actually means to me. Sterling offered another thin, highly polite smile. Oh, I think I have a very clear idea, Mr. Reynolds. Have a wonderful afternoon. Sterling turned and walked briskly out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors closing smoothly behind him. He walked straight down the long carpeted hallway, bypassing the elevator bank entirely, and pushing through the heavy door to the quiet, deserted emergency stairwell. Once he was entirely alone in the concrete stairwell, Sterling reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a highly secure, encrypted cell phone. He dialed a private, restricted number and waited patiently for the quick connection. Ms. Pierce Sterling said, his voice dropping its polite professional facade and taking on a sharp, incredibly lethal edge. He took the bait completely. He just signed it himself directly in front of a witness. We have him dead to rights on federal wire fraud and first-degree forgery. The trap is officially closed. I ended the call with Sterling and placed the encrypted phone gently on the massive polished mahogany desk. The trap was officially closed. I was standing perfectly still in the center of my father's primary war room, deep inside the heavily guarded stone walls of the Pierce estate. The room was an absolute fortress of dark, rich wood floor-to-ceiling antique bookshelves and cutting-edge digital displays that were currently tracking highly volatile global financial markets. The air in the room was thick with the wealthy scent of aged leather, imported cigars, and the quiet, undeniable hum of absolute generational power. My father, Desmond Pierce, stood by an antique crystal decanter, slowly, deliberately pouring 2 generous measures of our most exclusive aged bourbon. He walked around the heavy desk and handed me one of the heavy crystal glasses, his dark eyes gleaming with a fierce, incredibly predatory pride. A soft, secure chime suddenly echoed from the main encrypted terminal resting on the desk. Sterling had just successfully uploaded the high-resolution scanned copy of the final mezzanine loan agreement from the corporate stairwell. My father reached out and tapped the massive glass screen, bringing the highly confidential image up on the primary wall monitor for us to examine. There, at the very bottom of the digitally projected page, was the signature. My signature, Nia Pierce. It was a completely flawless visual forgery, executed with the desperate, reckless precision of a completely cornered animal. Julian had actually done it. He had been arrogant enough and entirely desperate enough to believe he could seamlessly commit a massive federal crime in broad daylight and simply walk away with $150 million of our corporate money. I took a slow, methodical sip of the burning amber bourbon, feeling it thoroughly warm my chest and steady my racing heart. He really thinks he outsmarted absolutely everyone, I said, staring intently at the massive glowing screen. He genuinely thinks Apex Capital is just some shady, anonymous shadow entity completely desperate to fund his ridiculous Horizon project because traditional banks were entirely too scared to take the ultimate risk. My father let out a low, dark rumble of a laugh, taking a measured sip from his own crystal glass. Apex Capital is absolutely not a shadow entity, Nia. It is a highly specialized direct corporate subsidiary of Pierce Holdings. We originally created Apex specifically to quietly acquire highly distressed luxury assets without ever drawing unwanted public attention to the primary Pierce family brand. Julian essentially just blindly walked right into the lion den and actively begged the alpha lion for a massive uncollateralized loan. And the sheer absolute beauty of his profound ignorance does not simply stop there. He actually thinks his personal wealth is entirely secure from your impending legal reach. He genuinely thinks moving his primary liquid assets to that obscure offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands completely shielded him from your inevitable divorce settlement. He honestly believes he successfully hid his stolen money in an impenetrable financial fortress that no domestic lawyer could ever successfully breach. I smiled, a cold, hard expression, completely taking over my face, as I looked away from the digital screen and directly at my father. But you quietly bought the fortress. Exactly, my father said, leaning back casually against the heavy edge of the mahogany desk, crossing his arms. Last week, while Julian was incredibly busy, aggressively planning his lavish charity gala and proudly flaunting his young pregnant mistress, I quietly and ruthlessly finalized the aggressive corporate acquisition of the specific private offshore bank currently housing all of his Cayman accounts. He foolishly chose that specific bank because Kendra's shady amateur accountant highly recommended it for evading standard domestic audits. The final ink officially dried on the international regulatory approval exactly 2 days ago. Julian does not just owe us the staggering $150 million for the Horizon project. We completely legally own the very bank vault where his entire life savings currently sleeps. His primary offshore accounts have been completely frozen indefinitely under a mandatory aggressive internal audit for suspected corporate embezzlement. He has absolutely zero access to a single solitary dollar. He cannot even buy a cheap cup of coffee right now. He is completely, entirely bankrupt, and the pathetic fool does not even realize it yet. The sheer magnificent scale of Julian's absolute destruction was breathtaking to truly comprehend. He had spent 7 long years deliberately making me feel incredibly small, intentionally stifling my voice, and making me entirely dependent upon his manufactured real estate success. Now I was firmly holding the literal legal deed to his entire financial existence in the palm of my hand. But this was no longer simply about taking his money or reclaiming my lost dignity. Taking his money was far too easy and incredibly boring. We desperately needed to make a permanent, highly public example out of his treacherous, ungrateful arrogance. This is no longer a simple, messy civil divorce matter, I told my father, setting my empty crystal glass down heavily on the polished desk. We are not just going to aggressively strip him of his ill-gotten wealth and publicly dismantle his ridiculous real estate empire piece by agonizing peace. He completely crossed a massive federal line today when he picked up that pen. We are going to permanently strip him of his actual freedom. My father nodded solemnly, fully understanding and embracing the heavy, severe gravity of the situation. Federal wire fraud aggressively executed across state lines, combined with first-degree institutional forgery on a highly regulated federal loan document, carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 agonizing years in federal prison. There is absolutely no wealthy, privileged bailout for this specific level of severe corporate crime. The FBI takes institutional commercial lending fraud incredibly seriously, especially when the deliberately defrauded entity is a major registered holding company like ours. Sterling already flawlessly recorded the entire illegal interaction using a concealed high-definition microcamera built directly into his briefcase. We legally have Julian visibly executing the forged signature on ultra-high-definition video, entirely destroying any potential legal defense his highly paid lawyers might attempt to quickly fabricate. The absolute crushing reality of his impending, irreversible doom settled comfortably over my shoulders like a warm, heavy blanket. It was finally time to properly prepare for the grand public execution. I left my father alone in the silent war room to securely finalize the immediate encrypted transfer of the digital video evidence to our elite corporate legal team. I walked slowly down the long, silent, thickly carpeted hallway of the massive estate, heading directly toward my massive private dressing room. The brightly lit room was an absolute sanctuary of exclusive high fashion and impeccable refined taste. My dedicated personal styling team had already meticulously prepared my absolute armor for tomorrow morning. Tomorrow was the exact day Julian and his greedy sister Kendra fully expected to arrogantly walk into the Apex Capital executive boardroom to officially finalize the massive wire transfer and aggressively claim their ultimate, undeserved victory. I walked purposefully over to the center velvet display mannequin. Hanging perfectly under the bright display lights was a sharp, incredibly ruthless custom-tailored designer suit in a deep, striking shade of midnight navy. It was impeccably structured, projecting absolute, unyielding corporate dominance and unquestionable financial authority. It was the exact kind of high-power suit an elite chief executive wears when they are fully preparing to ruthlessly and publicly dismantle a massive industry competitor. I carefully slipped into the impeccably tailored high-waisted trousers and slowly buttoned the sharp-structured blazer. The expensive imported fabric felt exactly like a protective second skin. It felt like absolute, pure, unadulterated power. I walked confidently over to the brightly lit glass vanity mirror and carefully opened a small, heavy velvet jewelry box sitting perfectly in the center of the smooth glass surface. Inside, resting beautifully on a luxurious bed of dark crimson silk, was the legendary Pierce family signet ring. It was a massive, heavy, solid gold band, featuring our proud ancestral family crest, carved directly into a flawless, solid black onyx stone. I had deliberately taken the heavy ring off the exact day I married Julian, quietly hiding it away in a highly secure bank vault because he always constantly complained that it looked far too masculine and incredibly intimidating for a humble, supportive wife to openly wear. He absolutely hated anything that made me look significantly stronger or wealthier than him. I reached into the velvet box and slowly picked up the heavy gold ring. The cold, smooth gold felt incredibly familiar and welcoming against my bare skin. I deliberately slid it onto my right index finger, exactly where it had always rightfully belonged. It fit absolutely perfectly. I stared intensely at my own reflection in the bright vanity mirror. The woman fiercely staring back at me was absolutely no longer the quiet, submissive, easily manipulated wife who silently accepted subtle insults at crowded family dinners. She was absolutely no longer the broken woman who stood silently by the ice sculpture while her arrogant husband proudly flaunted his young pregnant mistress. She was Nia Pierce, the sole legitimate heir to a massive multi-billion-dollar global financial empire and the newly appointed absolute chief executive officer of Pierce Holdings. I picked up my newly encrypted high-security smartphone from the edge of the glass vanity table. I had explicitly instructed my elite corporate public relations team to officially activate and aggressively verify my brand new corporate social media accounts this morning. I opened the primary application and immediately navigated directly to Julian's highly public profile. He had just posted a brand new picture exactly 5 minutes ago. It was a highly polished, heavily professionally edited photograph taken directly at his lavish award dinner earlier in the evening. Julian was standing proudly center stage wearing his expensive custom tuxedo and holding his shiny, incredibly meaningless Black Entrepreneur of the Year trophy high in the air. Sasha was standing right beside him, wearing my stolen diamond anniversary necklace and gazing up at him with an absolutely ridiculous, exaggerated expression of manufactured adoration. The caption underneath the incredibly smug, arrogant photograph read exactly one word: unstoppable. A cold, incredibly lethal smile slowly naturally spread across my face. He truly believed he had successfully secured the massive Apex Capital loan entirely behind my back. He truly believed he had completely outsmarted me and permanently secured his flawless, untouchable elite legacy. He was proudly aggressively celebrating his ultimate victory while standing directly on top of a highly explosive hidden financial landmine. I tapped the phone screen quickly, switching my active profile from my old private anonymous account to my brand new officially verified highly public corporate account. The highly coveted verified blue checkmark gleamed brightly next to my full legal name and my official dominating title: Nia Pierce, Chief Executive Officer of Pierce Holdings. I slowly scrolled back down to his incredibly arrogant, completely oblivious, smug photograph. I gently tapped the screen and officially liked the picture. I dropped my smartphone back onto the smooth glass vanity table and turned purposefully toward the heavy oak door. The lavish award dinner officially celebrating Julian was currently taking place at the grand ballroom of the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta, just 30 short minutes away. It was the absolute perfect time to finally make my highly anticipated public appearance. I walked out of my massive private dressing room and headed straight down the grand, sweeping staircase of the estate. Marcus was already standing patiently by the massive front doors, flanked by 3 additional, highly trained security operatives. They were all dressed in pristine, tailored black suits, wearing discreet communication earpieces, and projecting a highly intimidating aura of absolute lethal efficiency. It was a massive, sharp departure from my usual solitary, quiet arrivals at these high society events. Tonight, I was formally arriving exactly like the billionaire chief executive I truly was. We took the custom-armored Maybach and a heavily tinted trailing black luxury SUV directly into the vibrant heart of the city. The entire drive was completely silent and perfectly smooth. When we pulled up to the glittering, brightly lit entrance of the Grand Hotel, the valet staff instantly recognized the heavy armored corporate vehicles and immediately rushed forward to open my door. I stepped out onto the pristine red carpet. The cool night air felt incredibly refreshing against my face. I smoothly adjusted the sharp lapel of my midnight navy designer suit and walked purposefully through the grand marble lobby. My 4 imposing bodyguards smoothly formed a tight protective diamond formation directly around me. Inside the massive glittering ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with expensive perfume, clinking champagne glasses, and entirely unearned arrogance. The massive room was packed with hundreds of Atlanta elite, including rival real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy, influential socialites. We paused right outside the heavy mahogany double doors of the main hall. Through the thick, solid wood, I could clearly hear Julian's booming, highly confident voice, heavily amplified by the massive professional sound system. He was currently delivering his highly anticipated, arrogant keynote speech. I silently signaled for Marcus to hold the heavy doors closed for just a moment longer. I deliberately wanted to hear exactly what ridiculous, fabricated lies he was eagerly feeding the captive, wealthy crowd. When I first started in this highly competitive, brutal industry, I had absolutely nothing. Julian projected loudly, his deep voice dripping with a sickly sweet, manufactured humility. I did not have a massive hidden trust fund to fall back on. I did not have wealthy, powerful parents to conveniently write me a blank check or effortlessly open exclusive executive doors for me. I started entirely from the bottom of the mud. I painstakingly built this incredible, massive empire with my own 2 bare hands through sheer relentless grit and unmatched aggressive determination. People constantly told me I was dreaming far too big, but I completely refused to quietly listen to the pathetic doubters. I absolutely refused to accept simple, comfortable mediocrity. The wealthy crowd immediately erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. I could practically hear him greedily soaking up the completely undeserved public adoration like a starving, desperate man. He truly believed his own ridiculous fictional origin story. Success is never freely given. Julian continued waiting patiently for the loud applause to properly die down. Success is aggressively and ruthlessly taken. It requires absolute total personal sacrifice. It requires you to brutally cut out the weak, pathetic dead weight holding you down and boldly surround yourself only with people who effortlessly match your ultimate elite vision. Tonight, as I proudly accept this incredible, prestigious Black Entrepreneur of the Year award, I want to specifically dedicate it to the bright, limitless future. I dedicate it to the Horizon Project. And I want to dedicate it to my beautiful, highly supportive partner, Sasha, who truly, deeply understands the massive, heavy burden of real, undeniable greatness. I looked directly at Marcus and gave a single sharp nod. Marcus immediately pushed both of the heavy mahogany double doors wide open. The thick doors hit the inner walls with a loud, echoing crack that instantly cut through the polite applause near the back of the massive room. I stepped directly into the grand ballroom. The bright overhead chandeliers immediately caught the sharp, impeccable lines of my tailored midnight navy suit and the massive, heavy gold Pierce family signet ring gleaming aggressively on my right hand. I was absolutely dripping in quiet, lethal generational wealth. I did not walk like a broken, discarded wife. I walked like an apex predator confidently entering a cage full of completely defenseless, fragile prey. The polite applause near the massive doors instantly died. The sudden heavy silence rapidly rippled forward through the crowd like a tidal wave. The only sound was the sharp, authoritative click of my expensive designer heels striking the polished hardwood floor. My 4 massive, imposing bodyguards walked in perfect synchronization directly beside and slightly behind me, effortlessly clearing an unobstructed path through the stunned, silent crowd. People rapidly parted like the Red Sea actively scrambling to get out of my direct path. They stared at my sharp suit, my flawless composure, and the highly intimidating private security detail. This was absolutely not the quiet, frumpy woman they were entirely used to quietly ignoring at these lavish events. Julian completely froze behind the clear, acrylic podium. His arrogant, triumphant smile instantly vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His hands tightly gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning completely white. Sasha, sitting front and center at the primary VIP table, stared at me with her mouth hanging wide open, her hands instinctively dropping to protect her stomach. Before I could reach the front of the stage, Kendra suddenly jumped up from her seat at the VIP table. She was wearing a cheap, extremely flashy sequined dress and looking absolutely furious. She could not handle the fact that I was actively stealing her brother's highly anticipated spotlight. "What the hell are you doing here?" Kendra screeched, her shrill voice echoing violently in the completely silent, cavernous ballroom. She aggressively stepped directly into the center aisle, intentionally trying to block my direct path to the stage. "Security!" she yelled frantically, waving her arms in the air. "Get this broke, pathetic ex-wife out of here right now. She is entirely trespassing." I completely ignored her desperate, pathetic existence and kept my eyes absolutely locked on Julian's pale, terrified face. As Kendra lunged forward, trying to aggressively grab my shoulder, Marcus smoothly stepped directly in front of me. He did not hit her or act overly aggressive. He simply raised his massive muscular arm and gently, but incredibly firmly, moved her completely aside, like she was a highly annoying, completely insignificant piece of floating lint. He entirely blocked her from coming anywhere near me. "Do not touch me!" Kendra screamed, entirely losing her balance, and stumbling awkwardly backward into a nearby table, spilling several expensive crystal glasses of wine. I effortlessly glided past her, completely unbothered by her loud public meltdown. I reached the set of velvet-lined stairs leading directly up to the main stage and calmly walked up them. Julian stood completely paralyzed, securely trapped behind his expensive clear podium. I casually reached out and smoothly lifted one of the elegant tall glasses from a polished tray held by a stunned event organizer. I turned slightly to directly face the completely silent, highly captivated audience. I looked back at Julian, raising the crystal champagne flute perfectly to eye level. I offered him a sharp, incredibly chilling smile that absolutely did not reach my eyes. "Enjoy the shiny trophy, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly clear, incredibly calm, and entirely audible through his highly sensitive podium microphone. "It is a truly beautiful, highly fragile piece of decorative glass. You should absolutely celebrate this massive, fleeting victory tonight, because tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, we officially finalize the Apex Capital deal in my executive boardroom. Bring your favorite silver pen." I smoothly lowered the crystal glass, casually placing it directly next to his meaningless Black Entrepreneur of the Year trophy resting proudly on the clear podium. I turned my back to him and calmly walked down the velvet stairs. My bodyguards immediately reformed their tight formation. We walked straight back down the center aisle, completely ignoring the confused, wealthy audience, pushing right through the heavy mahogany double doors. Up on the stage, Julian was terrified. Sasha quickly grabbed his stiff arm, aggressively asking what was going on. He forced a highly shaky, dismissive smile. "It is absolutely nothing," he lied to her. "She is just entirely unstable. My broke ex-wife is clearly having a massive, severe psychotic break." Julian looked over at Harrison, desperately, silently begging for some kind of aggressive legal intervention. He wanted his highly paid bulldog of a lawyer to instantly slam his fist on the marble table object to the proceedings and magically extract him from this suffocating nightmare. But Harrison simply sat completely frozen in his expensive leather chair. Harrison was a seasoned corporate veteran who fully understood the lethal gravity of the situation. He recognized that Desmond Pierce did not casually attend meetings, unless he already held all the executioner cards. Harrison carefully closed his thick leather briefcase, entirely refusing to make direct eye contact with his suddenly toxic client. I leaned back slightly in the heavy executive chair, letting the deafening silence stretch and amplify Julian's absolute terror. You never actually possessed unmatched negotiation skills, Julian. I continued, my voice calm and relentlessly steady. My father simply made 3 highly classified phone calls. He gently reminded those competing development firms about their own outstanding massive debts to Pierce Holdings. They immediately withdrew their bids, leaving the path completely clear for you to effortlessly walk through. I spent 7 agonizing years meticulously smoothing the gravel, clearing the heavy obstacles, and ensuring the weather was absolutely perfect, so you could proudly strut forward and pretend you commanded the very elements. Julian aggressively grabbed the edge of the black marble table, his knuckles entirely white, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "You are completely lying," he hissed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "You are just a bitter, vindictive woman trying to retroactively claim credit for my endless hard work. I built this massive company with my own sweat and blood. I am the sole recognized genius behind the Horizon Project." I slowly smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that caused Kendra to physically flinch across the table. "If you are truly a recognized genius, Julian, then you absolutely do not need my money today," I countered smoothly. I reached out and gently rested my manicured fingers on top of the forged Apex Capital contract. "If you are entirely self-made, then you can easily walk right out of those heavy steel doors and magically secure $150 million in completely clean liquid capital before your primary lenders officially seize your land deposits tomorrow afternoon." Julian completely froze. The pathetic illusion of his aggressive bravado instantly evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold, crushing reality of his massive impending default. He knew exactly what was waiting for him outside this glass boardroom. Total, unmitigated financial ruin. "Fine," Julian suddenly spat, trying to aggressively pivot to a completely new defensive strategy. "Keep your pathetic, dirty money. Cancel the mezzanine loan right now. I do not want a single solitary dime from you or your incredibly arrogant father. The Horizon Project was just a massive headache anyway. I will simply liquidate the domestic corporate assets and completely restructure. You think you can aggressively trap me here, Nia, but you are entirely wrong." He aggressively straightened his suit jacket, trying to desperately project a highly confident aura he absolutely did not feel. He looked down at me with a nasty, vicious sneer. "You think you completely destroyed me, but I planned for massive, catastrophic emergencies. I have tens of millions of dollars completely safely secured in my private offshore shell company, Apex Holdings in the Cayman Islands. It is entirely untouchable. I will simply take Sasha, and we will comfortably relocate. I will easily build a brand new real estate empire somewhere else, and you will remain a pathetic, lonely woman sitting in an empty glass room." Sasha visibly perked up at the direct mention of the massive offshore millions. She aggressively pulled her designer diaper bag closer to her chest, offering me a highly smug, vindictive look. "We do not need you at all," she chimed in, her high-pitched voice echoing annoyingly in the quiet room. "Julian is incredibly wealthy all by himself." I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up a sleek black tablet resting near the edge of the marble table and smoothly slid it directly across the smooth, dark stone. It stopped perfectly right in front of Julian. "Pick it up, Julian," I commanded, my tone absolutely unyielding. Julian hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward my father, who remained completely silent and imposing by the door. Julian slowly reached out with a violently trembling hand and picked up the expensive tablet. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying a highly secure international banking portal. "You truly are incredibly predictable, Julian," I said, watching his dark eyes frantically scan the complex financial data. "You aggressively moved every single liquid asset you possessed into that specific Cayman Island bank because Kendra's cheap amateur accountant highly recommended it for evading standard domestic audits. You genuinely thought hiding your massive stolen wealth on a tiny tropical island completely shielded you from my impending divorce settlement. Julian stared at the bright screen, the remaining color draining entirely from his face. His mouth hung slightly open, his breathing becoming incredibly rapid and shallow. "What does it say?" Julian Kendra demanded aggressively, leaning over the table trying to read the glowing screen. "Tell us what it says right now." Julian could not speak. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the absolute disaster unfolding directly before his eyes. Since Julian seems to have suddenly lost his booming, highly confident voice, "I will gladly read it for you," I announced, my voice echoing cleanly against the thick glass walls. The secure portal clearly states that the primary financial institution, previously known as the Cayman Island Commerce Bank, was legally and aggressively acquired by a corporate subsidiary of Pierce Holdings exactly 1 week ago. Furthermore, it states that the specific private accounts registered to Apex Holdings have been officially and indefinitely frozen pending a massive federal internal audit for suspected corporate embezzlement. Kendra let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold marble table, lacing my fingers together. "You absolutely do not have tens of millions of dollars safely secured in the Caribbean," Julian, I explained, speaking incredibly slowly, so every single devastating word fully penetrated his massive, fragile ego. "You currently possess absolutely zero access to a single solitary dollar. Your credit cards are bouncing at local art auctions. Your domestic accounts are heavily overdrawn. Your sister was just aggressively evicted from her prime commercial real estate location because you cannot afford to secretly subsidize her failing luxury spa anymore. You cannot even afford to buy a cheap cup of coffee right now. You are entirely, completely, and utterly bankrupt." The heavy glass boardroom descended into absolute deafening silence. The sheer terrifying reality of the situation rapidly crashed down on the pathetic entourage. Sasha was the very first person to violently react to the massive sinking ship. The young public relations director aggressively dropped her smug, vindictive attitude the exact second she fully realized the offshore millions were a complete illusion. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic and profound disgust. "You told me we were entirely secure," Sasha practically screamed aggressively, shoving her heavy designer diaper bag away from him. "You swore to me that the money was completely safe in the islands. You promised me a massive luxury penthouse and a private lifestyle. You are completely broke. You dragged me into this massive, humiliating disaster and you literally have nothing." Sasha, Julian pleaded, reaching out to grab her wrist, his voice completely cracking. "Baby, please just calm down. I can absolutely fix this. I just need to make a few quick calls. Do not ever touch me," Sasha hissed violently, snatching her arm away from his desperate grip. She quickly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. "I am not spending the best years of my absolute youth raising a baby in a tiny, pathetic apartment with a completely bankrupt fraud. You are entirely pathetic." Sasha immediately turned around and aggressively marched toward the heavy steel double doors, entirely ignoring Julian's desperate, pathetic pleas for her to stop. She quickly squeezed past my imposing father without making direct eye contact, and practically ran down the carpeted hallway, completely abandoning the man she swore she loved just 10 minutes earlier. Julian watched her leave his entire world, aggressively collapsing into fine dust. He slowly turned his head back to the table, his eyes entirely hollow and completely devoid of any remaining arrogance. Kendra was quietly sobbing in her expensive leather chair, her face buried deep in her shaking hands. She finally realized that her entire lavish lifestyle, entirely funded by her brother's stolen money, was permanently over. She would have to go back to the exact same modest neighborhood she constantly openly mocked and desperately tried to escape. Julian slowly sank down to his knees, right there on the pristine marble floor. The self-made billionaire, the arrogant king of Atlanta real estate, was physically kneeling directly at my feet. He looked up at me, tears freely streaming down his pale cheeks. His massive pride was entirely, completely broken. Nia, please. He begged, his voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. Please, I am incredibly sorry. I was a massive, arrogant fool. I completely lost my way. You built me, and I viciously betrayed you. I know I deserve absolutely every single ounce of your intense anger. But please do not completely destroy me like this. Do not take my entire company. I will completely change. I will rip up the divorce papers right now. I swear to you, I will officially rip them up, and we can just go back to exactly how things were. We can be a true, powerful partnership. Just please release the funds and save my life. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt absolutely no lingering affection. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute lethal closure. I slowly smiled, leaning slightly over the edge of the heavy black marble table. Oh, Julian, I whispered, my voice soft but incredibly sharp, cutting right through his desperate, pathetic sobbing. The divorce decree is the absolutely only legal document you signed recently that I actually completely agree with. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and smoothly slid the thick manila folder slightly closer to the center of the polished black marble table. Julian was still kneeling directly on the cold floor, his chest heaving with desperate, pathetic sobs. He had completely surrendered to the massive financial ruin crashing down upon his fragile ego. But financial ruin was merely the opening act of this highly orchestrated execution. I did not just want to leave him broke, I wanted to leave him permanently caged. I tapped my manicured index finger against the thick paper resting inside the folder. The divorce decree completely strips you of my massive hidden assets, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a low, highly dangerous register. But let us talk about this specific document right here. The one you so eagerly and recklessly signed just an hour ago. Julian slowly lifted his tear-stained face from the marble floor. He looked at the folder, his red, bloodshot eyes blinking in profound, intense confusion. It took his massive, panicked brain a few incredibly long seconds to fully process exactly what document was currently resting under my hand. When the dark, terrifying realization finally hit him, he let out a sharp, highly audible gasp. He scrambled clumsily backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping aggressively against the polished stone floor until his back hit the glass wall of the boardroom. I opened the folder entirely, revealing the final execution page of the Federal Mezzanine Loan Agreement. There, right on the primary signature line, was my full legal name, perfectly and flawlessly forged in his highly practiced handwriting. You were incredibly desperate, Julian, I explained, leaning forward and staring directly into his terrified eyes. You were completely blinded by your massive, fragile ego and the sheer terrifying prospect of losing your shiny, fabricated empire. You genuinely thought Apex Capital was your ultimate elite savior. You thought you could seamlessly bypass federal lending laws by simply taking a silver pen and illegally signing the name of the sole legitimate heir to Pierce Holdings. Harrison, the highly paid corporate lawyer who had been sitting completely frozen in his chair, suddenly shot up as if he had been physically struck by lightning. The remaining blood instantly drained entirely from his seasoned face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at the forged signature on the massive black marble table with absolute, sheer, unadulterated horror. Julian, what did you do? Harrison shouted, his highly professional composure completely shattering. Did you actually physically sign her name on that specific document in front of the Apex Capital broker? Julian could not even form a coherent sentence. He simply nodded his head up and down, a pathetic, whining sound escaping his throat. You massive, complete idiot! Harrison screamed aggressively, grabbing his thick leather briefcase from the marble table. That is a federally backed financial instrument. That is entirely regulated by the federal government. You just committed first-degree institutional forgery and massive federal wire fraud in broad daylight. You literally handed a massive multi-billion-dollar holding company written physical proof of a severe federal felony. Harrison did not wait for a single response. He aggressively clicked his heavy briefcase shut with trembling hands. He was a highly experienced corporate bulldog, and he knew exactly when a sinking ship was entirely beyond saving. He knew that associating with this specific level of severe corporate crime would instantly trigger his own immediate disbarment and completely destroy his highly lucrative legal career. I am completely officially withdrawing as your legal counsel, effective immediately. Harrison announced, his voice shaking with absolute blind panic. I will not be a willing party to a massive federal crime. Do not ever contact my office again, Julian. You are entirely, completely on your own. Harrison aggressively turned around and practically sprinted toward the heavy steel double doors. He completely ignored Julian desperately calling out his name. He bypassed my incredibly imposing father without even making a single ounce of eye contact, and rushed frantically down the carpeted hallway, desperate to physically escape the massive radioactive blast zone of Julian's impending destruction. Julian watched his absolute best line of legal defense aggressively abandon him. He curled his knees up to his chest, looking like a completely broken, terrified child. But the absolute worst of his immediate nightmare was just beginning. Kendra, who had been quietly hyperventilating in her expensive leather chair, suddenly stopped crying. She slowly looked up, her eyes wide with a brand new terrifying realization. She looked directly at her pathetic, kneeling brother, her face twisting into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. The loans, Kendra whispered, her voice entirely hoarse. Julian, the primary business loans for my luxury spa. You aggressively cross-collateralized my domestic business accounts with your corporate holding company when you originally expanded the Horizon project. Julian flinched actively, trying to physically shrink away from her intense, furious gaze. Kendra, please, he begged weakly. I was going to completely pay it all back. I just needed the temporary liquid capital to secure the initial land deposits. You completely ruined me, Kendra shrieked violently, launching herself out of the leather chair. She aggressively grabbed the heavy crystal water pitcher from the center of the marble table and violently hurled it directly at him. The heavy crystal shattered aggressively against the glass wall inches from his head, raining sharp, heavy shards and freezing water all over his expensive custom suit. I told you to forge the signature because I thought you actually knew what you were doing, Kendra screamed entirely, throwing him completely under the massive federal bus to desperately save her own skin. I thought you were actually smart. You are a complete pathetic fraud. My spa is entirely gone. My personal bank accounts are going to be completely seized by the federal government to pay off your massive fraudulent debts. You completely destroyed our entire family. I sat quietly at the head of the heavy black marble table, smoothly lacing my fingers together and watching the incredibly entertaining absolute destruction of their toxic family dynamic. For 7 long years, they had actively conspired to completely belittle me, intentionally exclude me, and aggressively mock my simple, modest lifestyle. Now they were violently tearing each other entirely apart in a desperate, pathetic bid for basic survival. My incredibly imposing father, Desmond Pierce, finally stepped forward from his silent, commanding position near the heavy steel doors. He looked down at the completely pathetic, weeping siblings with a look of absolute sheer disgust. There is absolutely no honor among greedy, desperate thieves, my father stated, his deep, resonant voice effortlessly cutting through Kendra's loud, hysterical screaming. You both aggressively worshipped the shallow, empty illusion of massive wealth, and now you will completely pay the ultimate heavy price for your sheer, profound ignorance. Julian scrambled forward on his hands and knees, completely ignoring the sharp, wet shards of broken crystal digging painfully into his expensive, tailored trousers. He aggressively grabbed the sharp hem of my midnight navy designer suit, completely desperate and entirely out of his mind with absolute pure terror. Nia, please. He sobbed, his face entirely covered in tears and desperate sweat. I will do absolutely anything you want. I will legally sign over the entire corporate holding company to you today. I will completely publicly confess to being a massive fraud. I will walk entirely away with absolutely nothing. Just please do not give that forged document to the federal authorities. Please do not send me to a massive federal prison. I will never survive in there. I am begging you on my hands and knees. I looked down at his incredibly pathetic, trembling hands, tightly gripping the luxurious fabric of my designer suit. I slowly reached down and firmly, aggressively peeled his desperate, sweating fingers off my clothing, entirely rejecting his pathetic, desperate plea. You aggressively tried to completely discard me in front of hundreds of highly influential people, Julian. I said, my voice incredibly cold, entirely devoid of any remaining human mercy. You proudly flaunted your pregnant young mistress right in my face and viciously told me to quietly go back to the projects. You aggressively threw a pathetic trash bag of my oldest clothes onto the marble floor of a building I secretly legally owned. You entirely lacked absolute human decency when you genuinely thought you held all the power. Therefore, you will receive absolutely zero mercy now that you hold absolutely nothing. Right on cue, the heavy steel double doors of the glass boardroom swung aggressively open. Three tall, highly imposing federal agents walked directly into the room. They were dressed in sharp, incredibly severe dark suits wearing their official federal credentials prominently displayed on heavy lanyards around their necks. The lead agent, a massive, broad-shouldered man with a completely shaved head and absolute cold professional eyes, immediately locked his aggressive gaze directly onto Julian. Julian Reynolds, the lead federal agent, barked his highly authoritative voice, echoing loudly through the completely silent glass boardroom. Julian let out a loud, incredibly pathetic wail, entirely collapsing flat onto the cold, wet marble floor. He buried his face in his trembling hands, completely paralyzed by the absolute sheer reality of his impending irreversible doom. "We have multiple active federal warrants for your immediate arrest." The lead agent continued smoothly pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his dark tactical belt. "You are being formally charged with massive federal wire fraud, aggressive corporate embezzlement, and first-degree institutional forgery of a federally regulated financial document." Two of the imposing federal agents stepped aggressively forward, entirely ignoring Kendra, who was now completely frozen in sheer absolute terror. They roughly hauled Julian up from the cold, wet floor by his expensive tailored jacket, completely forcing his arms violently behind his back. The loud, sharp, aggressive click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed incredibly cleanly through the vast, silent room. Julian did not even try to actively physically resist. He was completely, totally, and utterly broken. His massive, fragile ego, his entire fabricated billionaire identity, and his incredibly arrogant superiority complex were entirely permanently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. As the aggressive federal agents formally read him his strict legal rights, Julian slowly, weakly lifted his tear-stained face. He looked directly across the heavy black marble table at me. His red, bloodshot eyes were entirely filled with absolute, profound, horrific realization. "You completely planned this," Julian whispered, his voice barely a weak, pathetic rasp over the loud, authoritative voice of the arresting federal agent. "You completely planned this massive trap from the exact night of the charity gala. You deliberately let me blindly walk entirely into this massive federal cage." I slowly stood up from the heavy executive leather chair, perfectly smoothing the flawless front of my midnight navy designer blazer. I looked directly into the completely hollow, shattered eyes of the man I had foolishly supported for 7 incredibly long years. "No, Julian," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, incredibly sharp, and entirely lethal. "I did not plan this from the night of the gala. I planned this from the exact moment you foolishly thought I was incredibly weak. You proudly thought you had completely successfully buried me. But you entirely forgot that I was a highly aggressive, deeply rooted seed." The lead federal agent firmly grabbed Julian by the shoulder, aggressively marching him toward the heavy steel doors. Julian stumbled awkwardly, entirely dragging his feet, his expensive, custom-tailored suit completely ruined and soaking wet from the shattered crystal pitcher. He was being roughly walked directly out of the massive glass building he proudly thought he was about to completely legally purchase. As the heavy steel doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind the arresting agents, the absolute silence in the room was deafening. I slowly walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking down at the bustling Atlanta streets far below. From this high vantage point, I could clearly see the black federal vehicles aggressively parked at odd angles directly in front of the main entrance of the building. My elite corporate public relations team had executed my strict orders with absolute flawless precision. They had anonymously tipped off every single major local news network, prominent financial blog, and elite society reporter in the state of Georgia. Down on the street level, a massive chaotic swarm of eager journalists, bright television camera crews, and aggressive paparazzi had already formed a tight, impenetrable barricade around the federal vehicles. The sharp, flashing lights of dozens of high-speed cameras aggressively strobed against the pristine glass facade of the building. I watched with profound, cold satisfaction as Julian was roughly marched through the revolving doors and thrust violently into the blinding, chaotic spotlight. This was the exact man who had just stood proudly on a brightly lit stage mere hours ago, arrogantly declaring himself an unstoppable self-made billionaire. Now he was desperately trying to hide his tear-stained, completely panicked face from the relentless flashing cameras, his wrists securely locked in heavy steel handcuffs behind his back. The aggressive reporters shouted rapid-fire questions, completely drowning out his pathetic whimpers. They asked about the massive federal wire fraud charges, the severely frozen offshore accounts, and the sudden catastrophic collapse of his heavily publicized Horizon project. Julian had absolutely nowhere to run and absolutely no expensive corporate lawyer to aggressively shield him. The federal agents roughly placed a heavy hand on his head and physically shoved him into the back of the dark armored SUV, slamming the heavy door firmly shut on his entire fabricated existence. My encrypted smartphone vibrated smoothly in my tailored blazer pocket. I pulled it out and tapped the bright screen. It was a secure live video feed directly from the head of my private security detail, currently stationed down in the wealthy Buckhead commercial district. The high-definition video clearly showed the prime corner retail location of Kendra's aggressively flaunted luxury spa. The massive expensive glass doors were propped wide open. 3 large heavy-duty repossession trucks were aggressively parked directly on the pristine manicured sidewalk. A highly efficient team of burly movers was aggressively stripping the entire commercial space completely bare. They carried out her cheap imported massage tables, the massive expensive crystal chandeliers she had foolishly purchased on high-interest credit, and the gaudy velvet waiting room furniture she loved to proudly post on her social media accounts. Kendra was standing completely alone on the edge of the street curb. The bright sunny morning had rapidly given way to a sudden torrential downpour, a common occurrence in the humid Georgia spring. She stood shivering in the heavy freezing rain, her cheap, flashy designer clothes completely soaked and clinging awkwardly to her frame. She was aggressively screaming into her cell phone, frantically swiping through her massive contacts list. She was desperately calling all the wealthy elite socialite friends she had aggressively bragged to just yesterday at the alumni brunch. She was begging for a temporary place to stay, a quick emergency loan, or even just a sympathetic ear. But every single call went straight to an automated voicemail. Her wealthy elite friends had already seen the explosive viral news alerts regarding Julian's highly public federal arrest. In the ruthless, hyper-competitive world of Atlanta, high society, toxic financial ruin was highly contagious, and absolutely nobody wanted to catch Kendra's lethal disease. She aggressively threw her phone onto the wet pavement and broke down into loud, pathetic, hysterical sobs, completely entirely alone in the massive city. I calmly locked my smartphone screen and slipped it back into my pocket. The highly satisfying digital execution was completely finished. I turned away from the massive glass windows and walked back toward the heavy black marble table. My father, Desmond Pierce, was standing completely still near the elegant built-in wet bar, discreetly located in the corner of the executive boardroom. He reached out with large, steady hands and selected 2 heavy crystal tumblers. He slowly, deliberately poured 2 generous measures of our most exclusive, heavily aged scotch. The rich amber liquid caught the bright sunlight streaming through the windows. He walked over and handed me one of the heavy glasses, his sharp, dark eyes filled with absolute profound pride. We did not immediately speak. We simply stood in this quiet aftermath of the massive corporate slaughter, absorbing the profound shift in the absolute balance of power. We raised our crystal glasses in a silent, solemn toast. We toasted to absolute, undeniable loyalty to the aggressive protection of our massive generational legacy, and to the ruthless, efficient removal of toxic, ungrateful parasites. The expensive, aged scotch burned wonderfully as it slid down my throat, a fiery, deeply satisfying physical confirmation of my absolute, ultimate victory. "You handled the aggressive extraction flawlessly," Nia, my father, finally said, his deep, resonant voice entirely filling the quiet glass room. "You completely dismantled his massive, fabricated empire with absolute surgical precision. He will absolutely never recover from this severe level of complete public and financial devastation. The federal prosecutors will aggressively seek the absolute maximum sentence to make a massive public example out of his extreme arrogance. He completely dug his own massive grave?" "Dad," I replied, setting the empty crystal tumbler down onto the cold, polished marble surface. I simply provided the heavy steel shovel and watched him eagerly jump straight into the massive hole. "But our aggressive work here is absolutely not finished today. Nature entirely abhors a massive vacuum, and Julian's sudden catastrophic removal has instantly created a massive, terrifying void in the local commercial real estate sector. If we do not aggressively step in and completely stabilize the immediate fallout, thousands of innocent, hardworking contractors, administrative employees, and legitimate local suppliers will be entirely ruined by his massive, reckless greed." My father nodded slowly in complete, absolute agreement. "The primary domestic corporate accounts belonging to the Reynolds Group are currently entirely frozen by the aggressive federal authorities. However, since Pierce Holdings officially legally holds the primary underlying debt for his massive initial acquisitions, we essentially rightfully own the entire overarching corporate structure." I walked purposefully over to the primary communication console, directly built into the center of the heavy marble table. I pressed the silver intercom button, immediately connecting to the elite executive administrative team stationed in the outer lobby. "Please immediately contact the current acting executive board of directors for the Reynolds Group," I commanded, my voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. "Inform them that their primary holding company has just been entirely subjected to a massive hostile corporate takeover by Pierce Holdings. Mandate their immediate mandatory physical presence in the primary conference room of their headquarters in exactly 1 hour. If any single executive fails to appear, they will be instantly terminated with severe legal prejudice and completely denied their comprehensive severance packages." I released the silver button and looked directly at my father. "I am going to aggressively purge the entire toxic corporate culture he painstakingly built," I stated firmly. Julian deliberately surrounded himself with weak, pathetic yes men, completely corrupt middle managers, and highly aggressive, unethical brokers who constantly enabled his massive, fraudulent behavior. I am going to personally fire every single one of them this afternoon. I will aggressively replace his entire failing executive board with highly qualified, incredibly brilliant, diverse women who have been unfairly overlooked by this incredibly stagnant industry for decades. My father smiled a sharp, incredibly dangerous smile. "It is entirely your massive empire now, Nia. Rule it with an absolute iron fist." I left the Apex Capitol building feeling lighter and incredibly more powerful than I had ever felt in my entire 32 years of life. Marcus drove the heavy armored Maybach smoothly through the bustling city streets, navigating the chaotic aftermath of the massive federal raid. I did not direct him to take me back to the heavily guarded Pierce estate. Instead, I instructed him to drive directly to the massive luxury high-rise building where Julian and I had previously shared our massive custom penthouse. When I walked confidently through the pristine marble lobby, the incredibly intimidating night concierge, who had actively helped Julian completely lock me out just a few days ago, practically jumped out from behind his polished desk. He had clearly seen the explosive viral news reports. He looked completely terrified, aggressively stammering profuse, desperate apologies and frantically holding the private elevator doors completely open for me. I entirely ignored his pathetic, groveling existence and rode the silent elevator directly up to the top floor. I stepped out into the massive, sprawling penthouse. The expansive space was completely, entirely dead and silent. Sasha had clearly frantically packed her massive designer bags and aggressively fled the absolute second she realized the massive offshore money was a complete total illusion. Drawers were violently pulled open, expensive clothes were aggressively discarded across the custom furniture, and her cheap, heavy perfumes still lingered aggressively in the stagnant air. My brand new encrypted smartphone buzzed aggressively in my tailored pocket. It was an urgent, high-priority message from the lead foreman currently managing the massive empty commercial dirt lot previously designated for the failed Horizon project. "We are completely ready for your absolute final orders, Ms. Pierce," the text message read. I smoothly typed my immediate, highly aggressive response. "Clear the massive lot immediately. Tomorrow morning we officially break ground on the massive Pierce Foundation Center for the Arts." I hit send on the message to the foreman and watched the delivery confirmation flash on the bright screen. The massive dirt lot was officially designated for the Pierce Foundation, but the absolute complete destruction of Julian's entire existence was actively continuing to unfold across the city. I walked slowly into the expansive living room of the penthouse and turned on the massive flat-screen television mounted against the pristine white wall. Every single major local news network and national financial broadcast was playing the exact same incredibly satisfying continuous video loop. It was the high-definition footage of Julian being roughly perp walked directly through the glittering marble lobby of the Apex Capitol building. The aggressive news cameras, tipped off perfectly by my elite public relations team, had captured every single pathetic, humiliating detail of his incredibly public downfall. The broadcast showed him stumbling awkwardly in his expensive ruined suit, his wrists securely locked in heavy steel federal handcuffs, his face pale and entirely, completely terrified. The news anchors were absolutely ruthlessly tearing apart his carefully manufactured self-made billionaire image. They displayed massive, detailed graphics showing the complex, severe federal wire fraud charges, the first-degree institutional forgery, and the catastrophic immediate collapse of his heavily publicized Horizon project. Financial experts were openly mocking his incredibly reckless business decisions on live national television. The sheer, profound public humiliation was absolute. I watched the screen as the broadcast transitioned to live footage from the federal courthouse downtown. Julian had just been entirely denied bail. The federal judge accurately deemed him an extreme flight risk due to his massive offshore shell accounts, entirely unaware that those specific accounts were already completely frozen by my corporate subsidiary. Julian was officially remanded to severe federal custody, wearing a standard-issued bright orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his massive, fragile ego. He was going to spend the next decade of his life entirely locked inside a tiny concrete federal cell, completely forgotten by the wealthy elite society he had desperately, ruthlessly tried to conquer. While Julian was aggressively trading his luxury penthouse for a cold federal prison cell, his incredibly toxic sister Kendra was actively experiencing her own absolute catastrophic freefall. My private security detail continued to meticulously monitor her pathetic, desperate movements. After being aggressively evicted and watching her entire luxury spa repossessed in the freezing torrential rain, Kendra had desperately attempted to secure a cheap temporary room at a low-end roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of Atlanta. The live security update on my encrypted tablet showed her standing aggressively at the dingy motel front desk, completely soaking wet and shivering violently. She was frantically shoving various maxed-out credit cards at the unbothered motel clerk. Every single card violently declined. The federal authorities had aggressively frozen all cross-collateralized domestic accounts, entirely tying her personal massive debts directly to Julian's severe corporate fraud. She had absolutely zero access to any liquid cash. Kendra aggressively pulled out her cell phone, desperately calling her so-called high society friends one absolute final time. The security feed captured her loud, hysterical screaming, echoing across the empty motel parking lot. Every single wealthy socialite she had arrogantly paraded around with had entirely completely blocked her number. They had aggressively scrubbed their social media profiles of any photographic connection to her, rapidly deleting her from their elite existence as if she were a highly contagious, lethal virus. She was left completely, entirely alone, standing on the cracked, wet pavement, clutching a cheap plastic bag containing her only remaining possessions. Her massive, unearned arrogance was entirely, completely, permanently extinguished. I turned off the massive television and walked out of the silent penthouse, heading directly for the waiting armored Maybach. It was officially time to execute the absolute final phase of the massive corporate takeover. Marcus drove me directly to the towering glass and steel headquarters of the Reynolds Group. The massive building which Julian had proudly, aggressively built, using the secret, massive financial backing of my father, was currently swarming with confused, terrified corporate employees. I completely bypassed the chaotic main lobby and took the private, secure executive elevator directly to the top floor. My father, Desmond Pierce, was already waiting for me inside Julian's massive former corner office. The expansive room smelled heavily of spilled expensive whiskey and absolute sheer corporate panic. Desmond stood perfectly still by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking directly down at the chaotic Atlanta streets below, where a few remaining police cruisers were still aggressively parked. He slowly turned away from the massive windows and walked over to the elegant built-in wet bar. He reached out with steady, powerful hands and poured two incredibly generous measures of our most exclusive, heavily aged scotch into heavy crystal tumblers. He walked over and handed me one of the glasses, his dark, sharp eyes gleaming with absolute, profound, fierce pride. We stood together in the absolute center of the massive Concord corporate headquarters. We raised our crystal glasses in a completely silent, highly solemn toast. We were toasting to the absolute aggressive protection of our massive generational family legacy, to the complete ruthless destruction of ungrateful parasitic frauds, and to the absolute undeniable power of holding the ultimate financial high ground. The expensive dark scotch burned wonderfully smoothly as it slid down my throat, providing a deeply satisfying physical confirmation of my absolute ultimate victory over the incredibly toxic men who thought they could effortlessly control me. Now, my father said, his deep, resonant voice filling the expansive, quiet office. It is officially time to entirely, completely clean house. I set my empty crystal tumbler down on the heavy mahogany desk and pressed the silver intercom button. I commanded the heavily panicked executive administrative assistant to immediately send the entire acting board of directors directly into the primary boardroom. I walked smoothly into the massive adjacent conference room. The long polished table was entirely surrounded by 12 incredibly nervous, heavily sweating middle-aged men. These were the exact toxic, corrupt executives who had constantly, actively enabled Julian's massive, fraudulent behavior. They had aggressively, happily profited from his extreme, reckless greed, while entirely actively participating in the aggressive marginalization of brilliant women within the commercial real estate industry. They looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unsure of what was about to violently happen to their highly lucrative careers. I did not sit down. I stood directly at the absolute head of the massive table, resting my hands flat against the cool, polished wood. As of exactly 8 o'clock this morning, Pierce Holdings has completely legally executed a massive, hostile corporate takeover of the Reynolds Group. I announced, my voice perfectly clear, incredibly cold, and entirely lethal. You are no longer employed by a self-made billionaire. You are now entirely subjected to my absolute, undeniable authority." The men shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, nervously adjusting their silk ties. The acting chief operating officer, a highly arrogant man named Richard, desperately tried to aggressively speak up to fiercely defend his incredibly lucrative position. Ms. Pierce Richards stammered, forcing a highly fake confident smile. "We are entirely fully prepared to seamlessly transition the overarching corporate leadership. We have massive institutional knowledge that is absolutely incredibly vital to maintaining the daily operational stability of this massive firm." I stared directly into his panicked eyes, completely entirely shutting down his pathetic, desperate negotiation. "You have absolutely zero institutional knowledge, Richard," I replied, my tone completely unyielding. "You aggressively enabled massive, severe federal wire fraud. You deliberately intentionally looked the other way while your incredibly arrogant chief executive officer aggressively systematically embezzled millions of dollars into offshore shell accounts." I smoothly pulled a thick, heavy black folder from my tailored blazer and aggressively tossed it directly onto the center of the massive table. "Every single one of you is officially entirely terminated effective immediately," I declared, watching the absolute sheer horror rapidly spread across their pale, sweating faces. "Furthermore, because you are all completely heavily implicated in extreme corporate financial negligence, your massive, highly lucrative golden parachute severance packages are entirely legally revoked. Security will now aggressively escort you completely out of my building. You have exactly 5 minutes to silently clear out your desks before we actively forcefully remove you from the premises." The heavy boardroom doors swung aggressively open. Marcus and a highly imposing team of my elite private security operatives marched directly into the room. The completely disgraced toxic men frantically scrambled out of their chairs, utterly entirely defeated, aggressively packing their briefcases with trembling, panicked hands. As they were roughly marched out of the room, another highly coordinated group of people confidently walked through the heavy doors. It was my brand new, entirely hand-picked executive board. They were incredibly brilliant, highly educated, fiercely aggressive women from highly diverse professional backgrounds who had been constantly completely overlooked by Julian's incredibly stagnant, toxic corporate culture. They took their seats at the massive table, projecting absolute, pure, competent authority. The massive, heavy rebuilding of the absolute empire had officially flawlessly begun. Hours later, after entirely completely securing the massive overarching corporate transition, I returned completely alone to the massive quiet penthouse. The expansive luxury space was entirely completely scrubbed of any lingering trace of Julian's pathetic, arrogant existence. The aggressive professional cleaning crew had meticulously removed his expensive custom suits, his gaudy, flashy watches, and his meaningless, completely hollow business awards. I walked slowly directly into the massive, pristine custom kitchen. The incredibly expensive imported marble countertops were entirely completely bare, except for one single highly significant remaining item resting exactly in the center of the massive kitchen island. It was a thick, heavy certified envelope legally delivered by the aggressive federal court system earlier that afternoon. I slowly reached out and opened the thick seal. Inside was the absolute original, authentic physical copy of the finalized divorce decree, legally severing any remaining financial or personal connection I ever had to Julian Reynolds. He had completely signed it in a pathetic, desperate attempt to save his failing empire right before the massive federal raid. I smoothly retrieved a heavy, sleek silver butane lighter from the shallow kitchen drawer. I smoothly flicked the heavy metal cap open. The bright, intensely hot blue and orange flame aggressively hissed to life. I held the thick legal document directly over the massive stainless steel kitchen sink and gently touched the bright hot flame entirely to the very bottom corner of the heavy paper. The thick paper aggressively caught fire almost instantly. The bright hot flames rapidly consumed his forged signature, aggressively burning away the massive painful lies, the severe heavy manipulation, and the absolutely toxic 7 years I had completely wasted. I watched the bright fire fiercely burn until it completely reached my fingertips. Then I simply let the massive burning document drop directly into the cold steel basin. I stood perfectly, entirely still in the massive silent kitchen, watching the absolute final remnants of my old, incredibly fake life completely turn into useless, fragile gray ash. The past was entirely, completely dead. Exactly 6 months later, the vibrant city of Atlanta was bathed in brilliant, warm sunlight. The crisp morning breeze swept through the bustling streets, carrying the distinct energy of a highly anticipated celebration. I sat comfortably inside the luxurious private green room of our new facility, adjusting the delicate, perfectly draped neckline of my stunning, brightly colored custom designer dress. The vibrant, bold emerald green silk beautifully complemented my skin and symbolized my complete rebirth. Across the plush room, a flat-screen television was quietly playing the local morning news broadcast. I paused to watch as the serious face of the lead anchor appeared. The breaking news graphic flashed across the screen. Julian Reynolds, the disgraced former real estate developer, had received his final legal judgment. The judge threw the heavy book at him deliberately, making a massive public example of his extreme corporate greed and severe federal wire fraud. Julian was formally sentenced to 15 incredibly long years in a maximum security federal prison without the possibility of parole. The broadcast briefly showed a highly unflattering courtroom sketch and then a short video clip of him being roughly escorted out of the courthouse. He looked incredibly gaunt. His posture defeated his massive, fragile ego, permanently crushed under the crushing weight of his absolute, undeniable reality. Resting casually on the elegant glass coffee table beneath the television was a copy of a trashy celebrity tabloid magazine. My efficient public relations team had playfully left it there for my personal amusement. Plastered across the glossy front cover was a highly unflattering paparazzi photograph of Sasha. She looked completely exhausted and washed up, desperately clinging to the arm of a bankrupt D-list reality television star outside a cheap diner. The bold headline mocked her spectacular fall from grace, exposing her pathetic, desperate attempts to pawn counterfeit designer handbags just to pay her basic monthly rent. She had aggressively chased the blinding illusion of wealth and ultimately ended up entirely with nothing but cheap fake plastic. And then there was Kendra. I did not even need a tabloid magazine to know exactly where her massive, unearned arrogance had ultimately landed her. My private security detail still routinely provided me with amusing monthly updates. Kendra was currently working a grueling minimum wage job as a receptionist at an incredibly cheap strip mall nail salon on the absolute extreme outskirts of the city. She spent her long, miserable days wearing an unflattering cheap nylon smock, sweeping up acrylic nail clippings, and constantly being loudly berated by demanding customers. All of her wealthy, elite high society friends had entirely permanently abandoned her. She was completely trapped in the exact same modest, desperate financial struggle she had spent her entire life actively mocking and ruthlessly looking down upon. I smoothly picked up a sleek digital remote and turned off the television, leaving their pathetic, ruined lives entirely in the absolute dark where they permanently belonged. I stood up gracefully from the plush velvet sofa and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak door. It was officially time to enthusiastically welcome the incredibly bright, limitless future. I stepped out of the private green room and walked confidently down the long, sunlit corridor. I emerged directly into the massive, beautiful, open-air courtyard of my absolute proudest achievement. A massive cheering crowd of hundreds of people immediately erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause the absolute second I stepped onto the elevated grand stage. I looked out over the sprawling state-of-the-art campus. We were standing directly on top of the exact commercial dirt lot where Julian had once arrogantly planned to aggressively build his highly sterile, soulless Horizon project. Instead of two massive, ugly corporate glass towers casting dark, cold shadows over the local community, the land was now home to a breathtaking architectural marvel: the Pierce Foundation Center for the Arts. It was a fully funded, vibrant community hub completely dedicated to empowering talented local youth, providing them with elite resources, beautiful gallery spaces, and entirely free advanced education. It was a permanent monument to absolute, true, lasting generational wealth. My imposing father, Desmond Pierce, was standing proudly right at the center of the stage. He was wearing an impeccably tailored light gray suit, looking incredibly happy and entirely at peace. He smiled warmly as I confidently approached, handing me a pair of massive, heavy, ceremonial golden scissors. I grabbed the shiny golden handles, feeling the satisfying heavy weight of the metal. I looked out at the massive, excited crowd, the flashing cameras, and the bright, eager faces of the young artists who would actively utilize this beautiful, massive space. I smoothly, firmly brought the sharp golden blades together, aggressively, cleanly snipping the massive, thick red ribbon perfectly in half. The crowd wildly erupted. Joyous, loud music instantly filled the bright, warm air, and colorful, vibrant confetti rained heavily down from the clear blue sky. I stood there bathing in the warm, radiant glow of my total, ultimate, undeniable victory. I looked directly into the primary news camera stationed firmly at the very front of the massive press pool, entirely breaking the fourth wall. "They say the best revenge is living well." I narrated, my voice perfectly, smooth, confident, and radiating undeniable lethal power. "But in my family, we do not just live well, we take back what is ours with interest. Sometimes the only way to show a king he is wearing no clothes is to buy the castle and lock the gates." I allowed a completely genuine, incredibly warm, beautiful smile to naturally fill my face. I turned my head and looked directly at my proud father, Desmond, sharing a profound, silent look of absolute, complete mutual understanding and deep, protective family love. I gracefully, confidently turned my back entirely to the flashing cameras and the loud, cheering crowd. I walked smoothly, purposefully, directly forward, stepping entirely into the beautiful, bright, wide, welcoming doors of my massive, brand new, unshakable empire. Fade completely to black. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by those who underestimate you. When people mistake your kindness for weakness, let them. You do not need to shout to prove your strength. Julian built his ego on lies, assuming he could easily discard me. But empires built on deception will always inevitably collapse. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is walking away quietly, only to return as the architect of their downfall. Never shrink yourself to fit inside another person's shadow. Have you ever reclaimed your power? Share below, like, and please hit subscribe.